They say you can't choose your family, but what they don't tell you is what happens when your family chooses to destroy you and then comes crawling back when they need you to save them. My name is Sarah Hartwell, and the moment my father ripped that phone from my hands at Christmas dinner, everything I'd built in secret for 19 years was about to explode into the open. You see, my family spent my entire childhood convincing me I was worthless, the invisible daughter, the disappointment. When I was 19, they made it official my brother would inherit everything while I got nothing. My father's last words as I walked out with $200 and a suitcase, "You'll never amount to anything without this family." He was wrong, but for nearly 2 decades I let them believe they were right. While they thought I was struggling and forgotten I was building an empire they couldn't even imagine, I became the person they swore I could never be: powerful, wealthy, and completely beyond their reach. So when that invitation to Christmas dinner arrived after 19 years of silence, I knew exactly what it meant. They didn't want me back because they loved me. They wanted something. What they didn't know was that I'd already discovered their desperate secret, and I was about to make them pay for every moment they'd made me feel worthless. This is the story of how I took back everything they stole and discovered the shocking truth my grandfather hid to protect me from beyond the grave. Trust me, you need to hear what happened next. My name is Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell. I'm 38 years old, and I'm the founder and CEO of a financial technology consulting firm that advises some of the most powerful institutions in New England. But none of that mattered as I sat at my family's Christmas dinner table, because to them I would always be the daughter who wasn't good enough. The Hartwell mansion looked like something out of a magazine spread. Garlands of fresh pine and white roses draped every doorway. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above arrangements of silver and gold. The dining room table could seat 20, though tonight only 5 of us gathered around one end, making the opulence feel even more excessive. My mother, Catherine, had outdone herself as always. She believed that if something looked perfect, it must be perfect, a philosophy she'd applied to everything except her relationship with me. I'd arrived 30 minutes earlier, and the welcome had been exactly what I'd expected. My mother's eyes had swept over my simple navy dress and modest jewelry with barely concealed disappointment. "Oh, Sarah," she'd said, her voice dripping with that particular blend of concern and condescension she'd perfected over decades. "You didn't need to dress down on our account. We know you're trying to be practical these days." And the implication was clear: they thought I couldn't afford anything better. That I was still the struggling failure who'd left with nothing 19 years ago. My father, Robert, had offered a stiff handshake, his gaze already sliding away toward my brother David, who stood by the fireplace in his designer suit, scrolling through his phone with the distracted air of someone far too important to be fully present. David had glanced up long enough to nod in my direction before returning to his screen. We hadn't spoken since I'd arrived. This was fine. I'd expected nothing less. As we sat down to dinner, my mother began her carefully orchestrated performance. She asked me bland questions about my little apartment and whether I was keeping warm enough in that old building. Each question was designed to emphasize the distance between their world and mine, their mansion versus my supposed poverty, their success versus my imagined failure. "We're just glad you could join us," Catherine continued, passing a silver dish of roasted vegetables. "Families should be together at Christmas no matter the circumstances." That word hung in the air. Circumstances, as if my absence for 19 years had been due to unfortunate timing rather than their systematic destruction of my sense of worth. I smiled and said very little. I'd learned long ago that silence unnerved them more than argument. I simply ate the overpriced meal and watched them perform their roles: the patrician mother, the distinguished father, the golden son. They'd been playing these parts for so long that I wondered if they even remembered who they really were underneath. David finally put his phone down long enough to contribute to the conversation. "Mother tells me you're doing some kind of consulting work," he said, his tone suggesting that consulting was a euphemism for unemployment. That must be interesting. It keeps me busy, I replied. Well, staying busy is important, my father interjected, cutting into his prime rib with precise movements. Idle hands and all that. Though I've always believed that real success comes from building something lasting. Legacy, not just staying busy. The implication was obvious. They had legacy this mansion, the family company, generations of Hartwell history. I had nothing. Or so they thought. That's when my phone rang. The sound cut through the soft classical music playing in the background like an alarm. I'd kept it on because I was expecting this call, and it was important. More important than this charade of a family dinner. I reached for my purse. Excuse me, I need to take this. My father's fork clattered against his plate. Absolutely not. His voice carried that edge I remembered from childhood, the tone that said he was in charge and would not be questioned. We are in the middle of dinner, Sarah. Whatever it is can wait. I'm afraid it can't, I said calmly, my hand on my phone. I'm talking to you. Robert's voice rose, his face flushing the way it always did when someone dared to defy him. This is exactly the problem with you always seeking attention, always acting like you're too important to show basic respect. Catherine placed her hand on his arm in a gesture that looked supportive, but was really just for show. Robert, darling, maybe just let her... No. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. In 3 steps, he was beside me. If she won't show respect in my house, I'll remind her what respect looks like. Before I could move, his hand shot out and snatched the phone from my grasp. It was a move he'd performed countless times during my childhood, taking things from me, confiscating privileges, demonstrating his control. The muscle memory of humiliation flooded back instantly. David smirked into his wineglass. Catherine's eyes gleamed with something like satisfaction. This was the family dynamic they remembered, and understood me, powerless, my father, in control the natural order of the Hartwell hierarchy maintained. Robert raised my phone to his ear, his expression triumphant. He was going to dismiss whoever had called, probably with some cutting remark about me being unavailable because I was learning manners. I could see the words forming on his lips. Then a voice came through the speaker, clear, authoritative, and utterly unmistakable even from where I sat. This is Governor Samuel Vance. Put Sarah Hartwell back on the line immediately. The effect was instantaneous and total. My father's face drained of all color, going from flush to pale in the space of a heartbeat. His hand, so confident seconds ago, began to tremble. The phone wavered in his grip like he'd suddenly realized he was holding a live grenade. Catherine's fork slipped from her fingers and clattered against her china plate, the sound obscenely loud in the sudden silence. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. David's wineglass stopped halfway to his lips, suspended in air as his eyes went wide with shock. The governor's voice came again, sharper now. Ms. Hartwell, are you there? My father's eyes found mine across the table. In them, I saw something I'd never seen before, complete and utter confusion, mixed with the first stirrings of fear. He was looking at me like he'd never actually seen me before this moment, because he hadn't. None of them had. And in that frozen silence, my family finally understood they knew nothing about who I had become. As my father stood there frozen, the phone trembling in his hand and the governor's voice demanding a response, 1,000 memories flooded back. Memories of every moment that had led to this one. To understand the shock on their faces, you need to understand who I had been in this family, or rather who they had decided I was. I was 7 years old the first time I realized I was invisible. It was the spring academic awards ceremony at my elementary school, and I'd won the Mathematics Excellence Award for the 2nd grade. I was so proud. I'd worked hard, stayed after school for extra problem sets, pushed myself, because I loved the clean logic of numbers. When the teacher called my name, I'd walked across that stage, beaming, clutching my certificate like it was made of gold. My parents weren't there. They'd forgotten. Simply forgotten. When I came home that afternoon, my mother was organizing a celebration dinner for David, who had managed to pass his fourth-grade spelling test after weeks of tutoring. The dining room was decorated. There was a cake. My father came home early from work to congratulate him. I showed my mother my certificate. She glanced at it while arranging flowers in a vase. "That's nice, dear," she said, her attention already elsewhere. "Go wash up for dinner. We're celebrating your brother's achievement." That became the pattern. Every single time. When I won the regional science fair at age 10 with a project on water filtration systems, David got a new bicycle for making the soccer team. When I scored in the 99th percentile on standardized tests, my parents threw a party because David had been accepted into a mediocre private high school. When I was awarded a full academic scholarship to a prestigious summer program for gifted students, my mother said we couldn't possibly manage the travel logistics because David had baseball camp that same month. David's accomplishments, no matter how ordinary, were cause for celebration and pride. Mine were inconvenient facts to be acknowledged and then swiftly moved past. "Don't be boastful, Sarah," my mother would say whenever I tried to share something I was excited about. "Humility is important for young women." But it wasn't about humility. It was about erasure. I remember watching my father's face light up when David brought home a B- on a history paper he'd barely tried on. "That's my boy," he'd said, clasping David on the shoulder with genuine warmth. That same week, I'd received straight A's and a personal note from my English teacher saying my essay on classical literature was the best she'd seen in 20 years of teaching. My father glanced at my report card for perhaps 3 seconds before setting it aside. "Good," he'd said. Just that one word. The message was unmistakable. David's mediocrity mattered more than my excellence. As I got older, my mother's interference became more active, more deliberate. When I was 13 and qualified for the advanced placement track in mathematics and science, I brought home the permission forms excitedly. I thought surely this would make them proud, their daughter being recommended for the most challenging courses available. Catherine read through the forms with a deepening frown. "I don't think so," she said, setting them on the kitchen counter. "Girls don't need that kind of pressure. You'll be much happier in the regular classes with the other young ladies." "But, Mom, the teachers said I'm ready for this. They said I'd be bored in regular classes." "Boredom builds character," she replied, her tone final. "Besides, these advanced courses will consume all your time. You need to focus on developing your social skills, learning to be personable and graceful. Those are the things that matter for a woman's future." I tried to argue. I even went to my father thinking he might understand the value of education. He barely looked up from his newspaper. "Your mother knows what's best. Don't make a fuss, Sarah." The forms went unsigned. I stayed in regular classes, finishing assignments in minutes that were supposed to take the class period, watching the clock and feeling my mind slowly starve. The next year, I ran for class president. I'd developed a whole platform about improving the school library and creating a peer tutoring program. I won by a landslide. I was so excited I could barely contain myself on the drive home. "Absolutely not," my mother said when I told her. "You're going to call the school tomorrow and decline." "What, why?" "Because it's too much responsibility for a young lady. You'll be expected to speak in front of people, make decisions, handle conflicts. That's not appropriate. A woman's place is to support, not to lead." "But I was elected. The students voted for me." "Then they made a mistake," Catherine said coolly. "You'll learn, Sarah, that trying to put yourself above others only leads to disappointment. Women who try to lead end up alone and unhappy. Is that what you want?" I declined the position the next day, humiliated watching a boy who'd barely campaigned take my place. This became Catherine's constant refrain. A woman's place is to support, not to lead. She said it when I wanted to join the debate team. She said it when I expressed interest in attending a science and technology camp for girls. She said it most painfully when I mentioned wanting to study engineering in college. Looking back, I can see that my mother seemed genuinely threatened by my intelligence. Every achievement felt like a personal affront to her. When I won awards, she became cold and distant for days. When I expressed ambition, she became almost frantic in her efforts to redirect me toward what she considered appropriate feminine pursuits. But the moment that truly crystallized my place in the family hierarchy came when I was 13. I'd come home early from school sick with a stomach flu and went quietly upstairs to lie down. My father was in his study with the door partially open on a phone call with what sounded like a business associate. "Succession planning," I heard him say. "Oh yes, David will take over when he's ready. We're grooming him carefully. He's got the Hartwell instincts, the right presence." "What about your daughter?" the other voice asked Tinny through the phone speaker. There was a pause. Then my father laughed. Actually laughed. "My daughter. She's not important to the company's future. David's the heir. Sarah? Well, she'll marry well, hopefully. That's her path." He said it so casually, so dismissively, as if my entire existence was an irrelevant detail in the Hartwell family story. I stood in the hallway feeling like I'd been punched in the chest. It wasn't just that they favored David. It wasn't just that they dismissed my achievements or restricted my opportunities. They had literally written me out of the future. In their minds, I was already gone, already married off to someone else already, not a Hartwell in any way that mattered. I wasn't being paranoid. I wasn't being too sensitive as my mother always claimed when I expressed hurt. I truly had no place in this family's vision. That night, lying in my bed, 13 years old and completely alone, I made a promise to myself. One day I would prove them catastrophically wrong. One day they would regret every dismissal, every restriction, every casual cruelty. I didn't know how yet. I just knew I would survive them long enough to show them exactly what they'd thrown away. But the worst betrayal, the one that would fuel my determination for decades to come, was the one I wouldn't discover until years later. That betrayal centered on the one person in my family who had actually loved me, my grandfather, William Hartwell. I was 14 when he died, and his death felt like losing the only safe harbor I'd ever known. Grandfather William had been different from my parents. When I showed him my report cards, he actually read them, his eyes crinkling with genuine pride. When I told him about science projects or books I'd read, he listened like my thoughts mattered. He was the only one who ever said, "You're going to do remarkable things, Sarah. I can see it in you." I didn't know at the time that he'd tried to protect me even after his death. His funeral was the last time I saw Governor Samuel Vance before I left home. He'd been grandfather's closest friend for over 40 years, and during the reception at our house, I noticed him having an intense conversation with my father in the study. Their voices were low, but tense. I caught fragments. William's wishes were very clear, and, "This is a mistake, Robert." I didn't understand what they were discussing. I assumed it was routine estate matters, the kind of boring adult business that didn't concern me. How wrong I was. A few days later, my father gathered the family in his study for what he called the reading of the will. It wasn't a formal legal proceeding, just him summarizing the key points. He explained that grandfather had left portions of his estate to various family members, with the bulk being divided among his grandchildren through trust funds. "David will receive his portion at age 25, my father said, looking at my brother with approval. "And Sarah will receive hers at the same age." He mentioned amounts so quickly I barely registered them. Something about David's trust being substantial, mine being smaller percentages and distributions. My mother nodded along like this was all perfectly expected. I was still numb from grief, barely processing anything beyond the fact that grandfather was gone. What I didn't know, what they never told me, was that grandfather William had actually left me 60% of his estate in a trust fund. 60%. He'd left David 30% and my parents 10%. In his will, he'd written words I wouldn't read until I was 27 years old. "I leave the majority of my estate to my granddaughter Sarah, who has shown uncommon wisdom and strength of character beyond her years. I trust she will use these resources to build something meaningful and good." The trust was structured to mature when I turned 25, which grandfather believed would be old enough for me to manage it wisely. It was meant to be my safety net, my launching pad, my inheritance from the one person who'd believed in me. Instead, it became the weapon they used to rob me. The will had named Samuel Vance as the recommended trustee to manage the funds until I came of age. Grandfather had been explicit about this. Vance was a lawyer experienced in financial matters and, most importantly, someone who couldn't be manipulated by my parents. He would have protected my interests. But my mother had other plans. I learned later that Catherine had launched an immediate campaign to change the trustee designation. She went to my father with carefully constructed arguments. Samuel is far too busy with his law practice to give this the attention it deserves. Besides, shouldn't we keep this in the family? David is Sarah's brother. Who better to look after her interests? The logic was absurd. David was only 17 years old, barely more than a child himself. But Catherine persisted, and my father, as always, bent to her will. When Vance objected strenuously at the estate proceedings, arguing that this violated William's clear intentions, my parents overruled him. As primary executors, they had the legal authority to designate an alternative trustee if they could demonstrate cause. They claimed Vance had a conflict of interest because of his close friendship with William. They claimed family trustees were more appropriate for family trusts. They claimed David, though young, would have proper financial advisors. What they didn't say was the truth: they wanted control of my money. Over the next 11 years, while I was being dismissed, restricted, and erased from the family narrative, David and my mother were systematically looting my inheritance. They made investments that no competent financial advisor would have approved. They used trust funds to bail out struggling ventures in the family business. They took management fees that were outrageously inflated. They treated my grandfather's gift to me like it was their personal emergency fund. Every time the company had a bad quarter, they'd dip into my trust. Every time David wanted to make a risky investment in some friend's startup, he'd use my money. They documented almost nothing, keeping records so sparse that it would be nearly impossible to prove malfeasance later. Samuel Vance watched from the outside, powerless. He'd challenge the annual trust statements when they were filed, pointing out the steady decline in value, questioning the investment decisions. But without being the trustee himself, and without my cooperation as the beneficiary, there was little he could legally do. He tried to contact me directly several times during those years, but my parents intercepted his attempts. By the time I turned 25, my trust fund had been reduced from what should have been $3.2 million to barely $1.1 million. Nearly 60% of my inheritance had simply vanished into a black hole of administrative fees, investment losses, and strategic rebalancing. But here's the cruelest part. I didn't even know any of this was happening. When I left home at 19, I assumed I'd been completely disinherited. My parents had never discussed the trust with me in any detail. They'd certainly never mentioned that grandfather had left me the majority of his estate. As far as I knew, whatever family money existed was David's, and I had no claim to any of it. I spent 6 years building my life from nothing, working 3 jobs, eating ramen, living in basement apartments. All while over $1 million that was legally mine sat in a trust fund I didn't even know existed. I didn't discover the truth until I was 27 years old. That's when Samuel Vance finally found me. I was working at a small fintech startup in Boston, beginning to build my career. He showed up at my office one afternoon with a thick folder of documents and an expression of deep anger mixed with relief. "Sarah," he said, "we need to talk about your grandfather's will." Over coffee that stretched into dinner, he laid it all out. The real percentages, the trustee manipulation, the systematic depletion of my inheritance, the records of what David and my mother had done. He showed me grandfather's actual words about my uncommon wisdom and strength of character. He showed me every objection he'd filed, every attempt he'd made to protect my interests. I sat there reading through document after document, feeling a cold rage settle into my bones. They hadn't just dismissed me. They hadn't just restricted my opportunities. They had literally stolen my future and watched me struggle, knowing the whole time that they'd taken what was rightfully mine. When I could finally speak, my voice was steady. "Can we prove this? Can we get it back?" Vance's expression was grim. Proving financial mismanagement after the fact is extremely difficult. They can claim every loss was due to market conditions. They can justify the fees, without clear evidence of fraud or self-dealing, and without someone willing to testify against them from inside the operation. He trailed off. We both knew what he meant. The family would close ranks. David would never admit wrongdoing. The documentation was deliberately sparse. A lawsuit would be expensive, lengthy, and far from certain. I looked at the statement showing the $1.1 million that remained. It was still more money than I'd ever imagined having, even if it was a fraction of what should have been mine. I could take it and walk away. Or I could fight for years trying to reclaim what they'd stolen, letting them consume even more of my life. And from that moment, I knew I could never rely on anyone but myself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before Samuel Vance found me, before I discovered what they'd stolen, there was the night that set everything in motion. The night I was 19 years old and my family made their rejection official. It was May, 2 weeks before my high school graduation. My father called a formal family dinner, which should have been my first warning. We only had formal dinners when something important was being announced. I'd assumed it was about graduation plans or perhaps college arrangements, though my parents had shown minimal interest in either. I was wrong. We sat in the dining room, the same one where years later I'd watch my father's face drain of color when the governor called. My mother had dressed for the occasion in a silk blouse and pearls. David wore a suit, looking pleased with himself in a way that made my stomach clench. My father sat at the head of the table with several folders arranged in front of him. "Sarah," he began, his tone formal and rehearsed, "you're nearly an adult now, and it's time we discussed your future and your role in this family." My heart began to pound. Some instinct told me this wouldn't be good. As you know, Hartwell Enterprises has been in our family for 3 generations. David has been preparing to take over the business since he was young. He understands the company, understands our values, and has the right temperament for leadership. David nodded solemnly, as if being handed everything on a silver platter required some special character trait. My father continued, "Now we recognize that you're also part of this family, and we want to ensure you have a secure future. So we've made arrangements." He opened one of the folders. "We've spoken with several appropriate young men from good families. Any of them would make an excellent match. We think you should focus on meeting someone suitable settling down. A spring wedding would be lovely, perhaps 2 years from now when you're 21. I stared at him. "You're arranging my marriage." "We're facilitating introductions," my mother corrected smoothly, "to men who would provide stability and security, men who understand our world. And if I don't want to get married at 21, if I want to go to college, have a career..." My father's expression hardened slightly. "We've discussed this before, Sarah. College is expensive and frankly unnecessary for your path. Your mother didn't attend university, and she's had a perfectly fulfilling life." "But I want to study business, maybe work in the company." "That's not appropriate," Catherine interrupted, her voice sharp. She took a breath and softened her tone. "Sweetheart, we're trying to protect you from the stress of business. It's a difficult world, very demanding. You'd be much happier in a supportive role." "We have thought of a position for you," my father added, as if offering me a gift. "Once you're married and settled, you could have a role in the company's charitable foundation, planning galas, organizing fundraisers, light responsibilities that would allow you to focus on what women do best, supporting others, and eventually raising a family." The words hit me like physical blows. They'd planned my entire future without asking me, a future where I would never lead, never create, never control anything significant. I would be decorative, useful for producing heirs and organizing parties, but never essential. "What if I don't want that?" I asked quietly. My father's face went cold. "Then you're refusing the generosity this family is offering you. We're trying to secure your future, Sarah. Without our support, you'll have nothing." "I'll make my own future." The silence that followed was absolute. David looked surprised that I was even pushing back. My mother's eyes narrowed dangerously. My father's jaw tightened. "I see," he said finally. "Then perhaps you should think very carefully about what you're throwing away." But I'd already decided. Somewhere during that conversation, listening to them plan my life like I was a doll they were dressing up, I realized I couldn't stay. Not for another day. Not for another minute. I stood up from the table. "I'm leaving." "Don't be dramatic," Catherine said. "Sit down and let's discuss this rationally." "There's nothing to discuss. You've made your decision about what I should be. I'm making mine." I walked upstairs to my room and began packing. 2 suitcases, that's all I took. Clothes, some books, my laptop, toiletries. I had exactly $214 in cash that I'd saved from babysitting and a part-time job at the library. It wasn't much, but it was mine. My father met me at the bottom of the stairs as I came down with my bags. "If you walk out that door," he said, his voice like ice, "don't expect to come crawling back. This family doesn't reward defiance." "I don't want your rewards," I replied. "I never did." His laugh was bitter and cruel. "You'll never amount to anything without this family. You think you're special because you got good grades. The world doesn't care about that. Without our name, our connections, our resources, you're nothing. You'll be back within a month begging for forgiveness." Those words seared into my memory. You'll never amount to anything without this family. I looked at him standing there in his expensive suit, so certain of his power, so convinced that I needed him more than I needed my own dignity. "We'll see," I said. I walked past him to the door. David stood in the hallway watching. For a moment I thought he might say something, might at least acknowledge that his sister was leaving. He shrugged slightly as if I were a guest who'd stayed too long and was finally heading home. My mother appeared in the doorway to the dining room. The expression on her face wasn't sadness or regret. It was relief. She was actually relieved to see me go. No one stopped me. No one asked me to stay. No one even asked where I was going. I walked out of that mansion into the warm May night with 2 suitcases and $200, and I didn't look back. The Greyhound bus to Boston left at 11 p.m. I'd chosen Boston because it was far enough away that I wouldn't accidentally run into anyone from my parents' social circle, but close enough that the bus ticket only cost $48. I arrived at 2 in the morning and slept in the bus station until dawn. Those first 2 years were the hardest of my life. I found a basement apartment in a neighborhood my family would have considered dangerous sharing space with 2 other women who were also trying to survive on nothing. The apartment was damp, the heating barely worked, and I could hear the subway rumbling beneath us at all hours. Rent was $350 a month, split 3 ways. It left me almost nothing for food. I enrolled in community college using federal financial aid, taking business and computer science courses. But classes were only part of my education. The real learning came from necessity. I worked 3 jobs: breakfast shift waitressing at a diner from 5 a.m. to noon, where I learned to smile at rude customers and survive on coffee and stolen toast. Electronics sales at a big box store from 1 to 7 p.m., where I learned to read people to understand what they needed versus what they wanted. And cleaning offices from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m., where I learned that the people who succeed aren't always the ones who start with the most. They're the ones who refuse to quit. Some weeks I ate nothing but ramen and peanut butter. I wore the same clothes until they fell apart. I walked instead of taking the bus to save $2. I studied in public libraries because I couldn't afford to heat my apartment. It was brutal and exhausting, and sometimes I cried from sheer physical and emotional depletion. But I never called home. I never asked for help. And slowly, painfully, I began to build something my family had never given me, a foundation of my own. I discovered I loved financial technology, the intersection of money and innovation. I started teaching myself programming languages during my breaks at work. I networked with other students, building relationships based on mutual respect rather than family name. I worked so hard that my professors noticed, and one of them connected me with an internship at a small startup. The hardship didn't break me. It forged me into someone who knew exactly what she was capable of enduring. Someone who understood that success built from nothing was stronger than privilege handed down through generations. And then out of nowhere, someone finally saw what my family never did. That person walked into my life on a Tuesday night in October when I was 20 years old. I'd picked up a fourth job, if you could call it that, working the graveyard shift at a 24-hour cafe near the university. It wasn't much, just refilling coffee and wiping down tables between midnight and 6 a.m., but it paid in cash and came with one crucial benefit during the dead hours between 2 and 5 a.m., when almost no one came in. I could study. That particular night, I was working through a complex financial algorithm I'd found in a graduate-level textbook on risk assessment modeling. I'd checked the book out from the library and photocopied the relevant chapters because I couldn't afford to buy it. The math was dense and challenging, requiring complete focus. I'd spread my notes across one of the back tables during my break, my cold coffee forgotten beside me as I worked through the equations. I didn't notice the man approach until he spoke. "That's Markowitz's portfolio optimization theory," he said, "modified for computational efficiency." I looked up, startled. He was in his late 50s, well-dressed, but not ostentatious, with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. A professor, I guessed, based on the leather bag he carried and the general air of academic authority. "You're familiar with it?" I asked, instinctively protective of my workspace. "I've seen it applied in various contexts," he said with a slight smile. "May I?" He gestured to the chair across from me. I nodded, wary but curious. It was rare for anyone to recognize what I was studying, let alone engage with it. "Samuel Vance," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "I lecture occasionally at the university, corporate law and financial regulation." "Sarah," I replied, not giving my last name. I'd gotten used to being just Sarah, unconnected to the Hartwell legacy. He glanced at my notebook covered in my cramped handwriting and sketched graphs. "You're working through the computational complexity problem, the challenge of scaling portfolio optimization for real-time trading systems." It wasn't a question. He'd assessed my work in seconds. "I'm trying to," I admitted. "I keep hitting a wall with processing speed versus accuracy trade-offs." What followed was the most intellectually stimulating conversation I'd had in months. Vance didn't talk down to me or assume I needed basic concepts explained. He engaged with my ideas, asked probing questions, and offered insights that opened up entirely new approaches I hadn't considered. When my break ended and I had to get back to work, I felt energized despite the late hour. "Same time next week?" he asked as he stood to leave. I hesitated. "You're coming back." "I often work late," he said, which I later learned was a gentle lie. "It's nice to have intelligent conversation over decent coffee." He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. Our conversations expanded beyond portfolio theory to broader questions of financial technology, market behavior, and the emerging field of algorithmic trading. He challenged every assumption I made, pushed me to defend my reasoning, and introduced me to concepts I'd never encountered. After the fourth week, he brought me a book. Not a loan, but a gift. "I thought you might find this useful," he said, handing me a hardcover text on advanced financial modeling that cost at least $150 new. "I can't accept this," I protested. "Consider it an investment," he replied. "I expect you to master it and then explain it back to me. I need to keep my own skills sharp." Over the following months, Samuel Vance became more than just an interesting conversation during my graveyard shift. He became my mentor. He introduced me to guest lectures at the university, where I met other people working in financial technology. He connected me with professionals in the industry, always carefully, always with my permission, never pushing too hard. He reviewed papers I wrote for my community college classes and returned them covered in thoughtful comments that improved my thinking. He recommended resources, suggested research directions, and treated my intellectual development like it mattered, like I mattered. When I was 21, still working my multiple jobs and slowly progressing through school, Vance mentioned that a small fintech startup he knew was looking for someone to help with data analysis. "It's entry level," he said, "but it's legitimate industry experience. I think you'd be good at it." I got the position. It paid enough that I could finally quit the overnight cafe shift and the cleaning job, focusing on just waitressing and the startup work while finishing my associate's degree. For the first time since leaving home, I could breathe a little. Through all of this, Vance never asked for anything in return. He never made me feel indebted or obligated. He simply believed in my potential and acted on that belief. When I tried to thank him, he'd wave it off. "You're doing the work, Sarah. I'm just pointing you in useful directions." I never questioned why he'd taken such an interest in me. I was too grateful, too focused on survival and advancement. I assumed he was simply one of those rare, generous people who believed in helping talented young people. I had no idea that our meeting had been anything but chance. I didn't know that Samuel Vance had known exactly who I was the moment he'd walked into that cafe. That he'd been receiving updates about me since I was 14 years old through a trusted contact at my high school. That he'd known within 3 days when I'd left home at 19. That he'd spent months carefully locating me in Boston, learning my routines, waiting for the right moment to make contact in a way that wouldn't frighten or overwhelm me. I didn't know that 24 years earlier, when my grandfather, William Hartwell, lay dying of cancer, he'd called his closest friend to his bedside. That in that hospital room with machines beeping and morphine dulling the pain, but not his clarity. My grandfather had said, "Sam, I know my son. I know his wife. I fear they'll fail Sarah. If they cast her aside, find her. Don't let her face the world alone." I didn't know that Samuel Vance had made a solemn promise to a dying man that he would protect his granddaughter if she ever needed protecting. That he'd honored that promise with patience and discretion, watching from a distance, until the moment I needed guidance most. I didn't know that the cafe meeting, which felt like a miracle of good timing, was actually a decades-old promise finally being fulfilled. All I knew was that for the first time in my life, someone saw my intelligence and potential and treated them as valuable. Someone invested in my success without trying to control or diminish me. Someone believed I could build something extraordinary. And under that guidance, I did. By 22, I was thriving at the startup. By 24, I'd completed my bachelor's degree while working full-time. By 26, I was being recruited by larger firms. And by 29, I was ready to start my own company. Through it all, Samuel Vance was there offering advice-making introductions, celebrating my victories. Our relationship evolved from mentor-student to something closer to friendship, though he maintained a certain professional distance that I respected. I thought I understood our dynamic. I thought I knew the boundaries of our relationship. I had no idea how deep the connection really went, and the higher I rose with his guidance, the more dangerous the truth beneath my family became. The startup Vance introduced me to was called FinGuard Systems, operating out of a converted warehouse in Cambridge with 12 employees and more ambition than capital. They needed someone who could analyze loan application data and build predictive models for default risk. The pay was modest, but the opportunity was real. I threw myself into the work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I arrived before everyone else and left after they'd gone home. I worked 80-hour weeks not because anyone demanded it, but because I was finally doing work that mattered, work that challenged every part of my mind. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something. The technical skills came quickly. I mastered Python and R for statistical analysis, learned SQL for database management, and dove deep into machine learning algorithms. But the real education came from understanding the human element behind the numbers. Every loan application represented a person making a financial decision based on hope, fear, need, or desperation. I learned to read the patterns of human behavior encoded in credit histories and income fluctuations. Within 6 months, I'd identified a critical flaw in our existing risk assessment model. It relied too heavily on traditional credit scores and missed subtle indicators that were actually more predictive of default. I started building my own algorithm, working late into the nights, testing it against historical data. The breakthrough came at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, fueled by terrible coffee and stubborn determination. I'd incorporated behavioral patterns that conventional models ignored: the timing of payments relative to paydays, patterns of small cash advances, frequency of account balance checks. When I ran my model against 3 years of historical loan data, it predicted defaults with 40% greater accuracy than the industry standard models. My supervisor nearly fell out of his chair when I showed him the results. "Sarah, I need to show this to the founders immediately." Within 2 months, FinGuard had rebuilt their entire risk assessment platform around my algorithm. Default rates dropped significantly for new loans. Our clients started noticing. And my name started circulating in Boston's tight-knit financial technology community. I was 23 years old, and for the first time I was being recognized for what I could do, rather than dismissed for what I wasn't. By 26, I'd moved to a larger fintech firm with better resources and more complex challenges. My reputation had grown through word of mouth in an industry where results mattered more than pedigree. Venture capitalists started calling me when they were evaluating fintech investment opportunities, wanting my opinion on whether the technology was sound. Banks consulted me on fraud detection systems. I was invited to speak at fintech conferences and industry panels. I declined every speaking invitation, every single one. This wasn't modesty or shyness. It was calculated strategy. I was building my career in the same industry where my family's company operated, and I couldn't risk them discovering me before I was ready. A speaking engagement would mean photos, publicity, my name in trade publications. Someone from their world would eventually make the connection: Sarah Hartwell, the disappeared daughter working in financial technology. I needed to build my foundation completely, become unassailable before that discovery happened. So I stayed in the background, influential but invisible, known by reputation to the people who mattered, but anonymous to the broader public. During these years, I built a network based on mutual respect and proven competence. These weren't connections inherited through family name or bought with old money. These were relationships I'd earned. Maria Chen, a venture capitalist who'd taken a chance on 3 of my recommendations, all of which had succeeded spectacularly. James Wu, a bank security director who'd implemented my fraud detection protocols and seen attempted fraud catches increase by 60%. Patricia Morrison, a former regulator who now consulted on compliance issues and valued my ability to translate complex technical systems into clear risk assessments. These people saw me as a peer. They trusted my judgment. They had no idea I was the discarded daughter of the Hartwell family, and I preferred it that way. I was Sarah Hartwell, but that name meant nothing to them except expertise and reliability. By 27, when Samuel Vance finally revealed the truth about my grandfather's trust fund, I'd already accumulated significant savings. I'd lived frugally despite earning well, haunted by memories of eating ramen and counting pennies. When I accessed what remained of my inheritance, the $1.1 million that should have been $3.2, I didn't spend it on luxuries or revenge fantasies. I invested it in myself. At 29, I founded Vance Tech Solutions. The name was both a tribute to my mentor and a strategic misdirection. People assumed Vance was a personal name or a fabricated tech-sounding word. No one connected it to Governor Samuel Vance, who by then had entered politics. The timing was perfect. The 2008 financial crisis had exposed catastrophic failures in risk assessment and fraud detection across the banking industry. Institutions were desperate for better systems, better analysis, better protection against the kinds of cascading failures that had nearly destroyed the global economy. Vance Tech specialized in exactly what they needed: advanced financial risk analysis and data security built on algorithms I'd refined over years of practical application. I used the remainder of my trust fund as seed capital and secured angel investments from contacts I'd cultivated. Maria Chen was my first investor. James Wu brought in 2 other bank security directors. Within 6 months, I had enough capital to hire a team of 12. I hired carefully, looking for people like me, brilliant but overlooked, talented but hungry, driven by the need to prove themselves rather than coast on privilege. I built a culture of rigor and innovation. We worked hard, but I paid well and treated people with respect. When someone on my team had a breakthrough, I made sure they got credit for it. The company grew faster than I'd projected. Banks needed what we offered, and we delivered results. By year 2, we had 31 employees. By year 3, 47 employees and annual revenue exceeding $15 million. I was 32 years old. I owned a beautiful brownstone in Boston's Back Bay. I had investments, savings, and equity in a thriving company. I was independently wealthy, professionally respected in my field, and completely financially secure. My family still had no idea I existed in their industry. They probably assumed I was working some dead-end job, struggling to make rent, maybe regretting my decision to leave. They were so wrong. But success always attracts attention, including the most dangerous kind. That dangerous attention had been circling my family for years before I even knew it existed. His name was Richard Hale, and understanding him would become crucial to understanding everything that happened next. I didn't learn about Hale until much later, when I was piecing together how my family's company had fallen so far, so fast. The story came from Samuel Vance from financial records and eventually from Hale himself. But to understand his role in destroying my family, you need to understand what my family did to him first. 14 years ago, when I was 24 and just beginning to build my career in Boston, Richard Hale was the chief financial officer of Hartwell Enterprises. By all accounts, he was brilliant. He'd joined the company 9 years earlier and had been instrumental in modernizing their financial systems, identifying profitable expansion opportunities, and navigating the complex regulatory landscape of international business. Under his financial leadership company, profits had more than doubled. He was meticulous, strategic, and completely devoted to his work. He had a wife, 2 children, and a reputation as one of the most talented financial executives in New England. People in the industry respected him. My father relied on him. Then came the merger. Hartwell Enterprises was acquiring a smaller international firm with operations in 3 countries. It was a complex deal involving cross-border tax considerations, currency hedging, and the consolidation of different accounting standards. Hale managed most of the financial due diligence personally, working 18-hour days for months. In the final stages, he made a mistake. A genuine, unintentional error in consolidating tax documents from the European subsidiary. It was the kind of mistake that happens when one person is handling too much complexity under too much pressure. The error didn't cost the company money, but it delayed the merger by 6 weeks, while accountants untangled the documentation. The board was furious. Catherine, always obsessed with appearances and reputation, was mortified that their CFO had made them look incompetent to the acquisition target. She pushed my father hard. This kind of mistake was unacceptable. It made the family look amateurish. They needed to take decisive action to restore confidence. My father, as always, bent to her will. Instead of addressing the mistake privately, instead of accepting that even exceptional people make errors under extreme pressure, Robert Hartwell made a decision that would set everything in motion. He fired Hale publicly in front of the entire board and several external advisors. He explicitly blamed Hale for nearly derailing a crucial merger through careless incompetence. The word careless was particularly devastating. It implied negligence, lack of diligence, unprofessionalism. It erased 9 years of excellence with one characterization. Hale tried to defend himself, to explain the circumstances, to point out his track record. My father cut him off. "Your services are no longer required. Security will escort you out." The public nature of the firing was intentional. Catherine had insisted on it. "We need to show we have standards," she'd said. "We need to demonstrate we don't tolerate incompetence at any level." She was thinking about their social standing, about what their peers would say about maintaining the Hartwell image of perfection. They didn't think about what they were doing to an actual human being. The destruction was swift and total. In the insular world of high-level finance, everyone heard about Hale's firing within days. The story spread with embellishments. He'd made multiple errors, he'd been negligent, he'd perhaps even been hiding something more serious. My father never corrected these rumors. In fact, when other executives called to ask about Hale's performance, my father's references were deliberately vague in a way that suggested problems he couldn't legally discuss. Hale was blacklisted. No reputable firm would hire him. His reputation for meticulousness and excellence was replaced by whispers of incompetence and unreliability. His wife, unable to handle the social humiliation and financial stress, filed for divorce within 6 months. In the custody proceedings, she painted him as unstable and obsessed with his career failure. She won primary custody of their 2 children. Hale went from seeing his kids every day to every other weekend. He lost everything: his career, his marriage, his children, his identity. For a man who had defined himself by professional excellence and family stability, the collapse was annihilating. From what I learned later, Hale spent the next 2 years barely functioning. He took whatever freelance accounting work he could find, enough to pay child support and rent a small apartment. He stopped seeing friends. He gained weight. He developed insomnia. Some months he could barely get out of bed. But somewhere in that darkness, despair transformed into something colder and more focused rage. He began tracking Hartwell Enterprises obsessively. He studied their quarterly reports, their strategic announcements, their personnel changes. He watched my father age, watched David grow up, and eventually join the company. He learned everything about the family that had destroyed him, looking for weaknesses, waiting for an opportunity. He also rebuilt himself, though not in the legitimate finance world that had rejected him. He discovered that his skills were valuable in gray areas, helping wealthy individuals move money through complex offshore structures, advising businesses that operated at the edge of legal compliance, connecting people who needed certain financial services with people who could provide them discreetly. He made connections with individuals who didn't care about scandal or reputation, who valued competence and discretion. He accumulated wealth again, but through channels that would never appear in any professional directory. And he never stopped watching the Hartwells. 3 years ago, when I was 35 and VanceTech was thriving, David was installed as CEO of Hartwell Enterprises. My father was stepping back due to health issues. Catherine had pushed hard for David to take over immediately rather than hiring an experienced external CEO as the board suggested. When Hale learned about this, he must have felt like Christmas had come early. David Hartwell, 32 years old, minimally experienced, clearly overwhelmed, desperate to prove himself worthy of a position he hadn't earned. The perfect target. Hale began his approach carefully. He attended industry events where David would be present, positioning himself as a sophisticated investor interested in emerging opportunities. He offered insights that made him seem knowledgeable and helpful. He cultivated the relationship over months, earning David's trust gradually. To David, Hale was a godsend, an experienced financial mind who believed in him, who offered guidance without the judgment he felt from the board, who treated him like a capable CEO rather than a privileged son playing at business. To Hale, David was a weapon, a tool he would use to destroy the Hartwell family from within, using their own arrogance and incompetence against them. This wasn't just about money laundering profits, though. That was certainly part of the plan. This was about revenge, about making them feel the same total collapse he'd felt, about watching them lose everything while knowing they'd brought it on themselves. And he chose the worst possible way to get to them, through their weakest link. While Hale was cultivating David and setting his trap, I was building something he never anticipated: real power that had nothing to do with family legacy. By the time I turned 38, I had become one of the most influential people in New England's financial technology sector. Most people outside the industry had never heard of me, and that was exactly how I wanted it. VanceTech Solutions had grown beyond my initial projections. We held contracts with 5 major banks, providing risk analysis systems that had saved them millions in prevented fraud. We consulted for 3 government agencies, including the Massachusetts State Treasury and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Our fraud detection algorithms were considered among the best in the industry. The most significant contract, though, was with the governor's office. When Samuel Vance ran for governor 4 years ago, I'd been one of his behind-the-scenes strategy consultants. I'd helped him develop policy positions on financial regulation and identify vulnerabilities in state financial systems that his opponents were planning to exploit. When he won, he'd asked me to continue advising him on financial crime prevention and regulatory policy. I refused any official title or public appointment. I didn't want my name in press releases or government directories. Instead, I worked as a private consultant, providing analysis and recommendations that helped him navigate the complex intersection of finance, technology, and policy. Our relationship had evolved into something beyond mentor and student. Samuel had become the closest thing I had to family, though I would have been reluctant to admit that out loud. We had dinner once a month, discussing everything from financial regulation to literature to his concerns about rising corruption in state contracting. He was one of the few people I trusted completely. What I didn't know was that he was still keeping one crucial secret from me. He was waiting for the right moment to reveal my grandfather's deathbed request, the promise that had brought him into that cafe 19 years ago. He'd tell me later that he wanted me to be strong enough to hear it, to understand it not as pity, but as the profound love it represented. Through VanceTech and my consulting work, I'd accumulated significant personal wealth. My company equity alone was worth approximately $5 million. I'd made smart investments in other fintech startups, several of which had been acquired at substantial returns. I owned my brownstone in Boston's Back Bay outright, along with investment properties in Vermont and Rhode Island. My personal net worth was approximately $8 million. I lived well, but not ostentatiously. My home was beautiful, filled with books and art I actually loved, rather than pieces bought for status. I drove a reliable car that didn't announce my wealth. I donated generously but anonymously to causes I cared about, particularly scholarship funds for women from difficult family situations. I deliberately avoided the social circuits where I might encounter my family. I turned down invitations to charity galas and society events. When my name appeared in industry publications, it was always in technical contexts that my family would never read. I'd built an entire successful life in parallel to their world, close enough geographically that I could have run into them at any upscale restaurant, but careful enough that I never did. The few people who knew my background assumed I'd simply moved on. They thought my reluctance to discuss my family was normal boundary setting, the kind of thing lots of successful people did to separate their professional and personal lives. They didn't understand that I hadn't moved on at all. Despite everything I'd built, despite every achievement and milestone, the wounds from my family remained raw. I'd learned to function around them the way you learn to function with a chronic injury, but they never truly healed. I'd had relationships over the years. Smart, accomplished men who seemed genuinely interested in me, but none lasted beyond a few months. I couldn't fully trust their motives. When someone said they admired me, I heard echoes of my mother's conditional approval. When someone wanted to get closer, I felt the old panic of being controlled. I built walls without even realizing I was doing it until another person would give up trying to scale them. I had employees who respected me, colleagues who valued my expertise, professional contacts who trusted my judgment. But real friends, people who knew the whole story, who'd seen me at my most vulnerable, I could count them on one hand, and even with them, I held something back. At night, alone in my beautiful brownstone with its high ceilings and carefully chosen furniture, I sometimes caught myself wondering if any of it was worth it. I'd proven my family wrong. I'd built everything they said I couldn't. I was successful, wealthy, respected in my field. But I was also alone. The anger that had driven me for 19 years, that had fueled every late night and every ambitious goal, was also the thing that kept me isolated. I couldn't let it go because I didn't know who I'd be without it. It had become so fundamental to my identity that releasing it felt like losing myself. I told myself I'd moved on. I told myself I was happy. I told myself that their opinion didn't matter anymore because I'd transcended their world entirely. I was lying. Every achievement was still in some small way imagined as a response to my father's final words, "You'll never amount to anything without this family." Every milestone was still measured against the girl they'd dismissed. I was 38 years old, and I'd built an empire, but I was still trying to prove something to people who would never acknowledge it. Some part of me knew this wasn't healthy. Some part of me understood that true freedom would mean not caring what they thought, not measuring my worth against their rejection. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are entirely different things. So I kept building, kept achieving, kept proving. I stayed carefully invisible to them while becoming increasingly influential in circles they'd never access. I constructed a life that was objectively successful and subjectively lonely. I thought I could maintain that careful distance forever. And that carefully constructed distance shattered when the invitation arrived. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday in early December, forwarded from my office address. Heavy cream cardstock, my mother's precise calligraphy. You are cordially invited to join the Hartwell family for Christmas dinner. 19 years of silence, and now this. I stood in my kitchen holding that card, and my first instinct was to throw it away. My second instinct was to call Samuel and ask his advice. My third instinct, the one I followed, was to find out why now after all this time. It took me less than 3 hours to discover what they didn't want me to know. One of the advantages of working in financial technology and consulting for government agencies is access to information. I knew people at credit reporting agencies, at business intelligence firms, at banks that held corporate loans. I made a few discreet calls to contacts who owed me favors, asked a few careful questions, and requested some public financial filings. The picture that emerged was catastrophic. Hartwell Enterprises was dying. Not struggling, not facing challenges, actively dying. Over the past 3 years, under David's leadership, the company's stock value had plummeted 60%. Major clients had terminated contracts citing quality concerns and missed deadlines. The company had taken on significant debt to cover operational shortfalls. Board members were quietly selling their shares. 2 senior executives had resigned in the past 6 months. The quarterly reports told a story of consistent decline masked by creative accounting and optimistic projections that never materialized. David had made a series of poor strategic decisions, pursuing expensive expansions into markets where the company had no competitive advantage while neglecting their core business. But there was something else in the data, something that felt deliberately wrong. Certain expenditures didn't make sense, payments to consulting firms and overseas contractors that seemed inflated. A pattern of cash flow that suggested money was moving through the company in ways that weren't reflected in the official operations. Someone was bleeding the company dry from the inside. I just didn't know yet that it was Richard Hale systematically dismantling my family's legacy as revenge for what they'd done to him. What I did know was that Hartwell Enterprises was months, maybe weeks, from bankruptcy. The only thing keeping them afloat was the family's personal wealth and their desperate attempts to maintain appearances. And that's when I understood why I'd received the invitation. I did some more digging this time into how my family might have discovered my success. It didn't take long to find the connection. Margaret Ashford, one of my mother's oldest friends from the country club, served on a state oversight committee. 3 months ago, she'd reviewed contract awards that included Vance Tech Solutions' consulting agreement with the governor's office. My name was listed as the company's founder and CEO. Margaret had apparently mentioned this to Catherine at a charity luncheon. Did you know there's a Sarah Hartwell who runs a financial technology company? Any relation. I could imagine my mother's face in that moment. The shock, the disbelief, the immediate calculation. Through additional discreet inquiries, the kind wealthy people make through their networks of attorneys and financial advisors, Catherine would have discovered that I wasn't just surviving. I'd thrived. I owned a successful company with government contracts and major bank clients. I had significant personal wealth. I was exactly the kind of person who could write a check for several $1,000,000 without destroying my financial stability. The Christmas invitation wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't about family. It wasn't even about guilt, though I'm sure they planned to deploy that weapon. It was about money. My money. Money they needed desperately and believed they had a right to. What made it truly insidious was that they genuinely believed I would help them. I learned this later, but Catherine had actually laid out the strategy to Robert over dinner one night. A friend who knew their housekeeper told me about it months afterward, how the staff had overheard the conversation. "She'll jump at the opportunity to prove herself to us. Catherine had said with complete confidence. Women like her always need validation. She's probably spent 19 years hoping we'd welcome her back. This is her chance to finally be good enough to finally earn a place in the family. Robert had apparently expressed some doubt about whether I'd forgive them so easily, but Catherine had waved him off. She left with nothing and built something small. She'll see this as her opportunity to be part of something bigger, something that matters, the Hartwell legacy. She'll want that. And they had constructed an entire narrative about who I was based on who I'd been at 19, the desperate rejected daughter who would be grateful for any scrap of approval. They had no concept that I'd built something far more valuable than their approval, that their legacy meant less than nothing to me. They thought they were offering me a gift, the chance to save them, to prove my worth, to finally be accepted into the family fold. They had no idea they were walking into a trap of their own making. I held that invitation in my hand and felt something cold and clear settle over me. For 19 years I'd avoided them, built my life in careful isolation from their world. I'd told myself I didn't care what they thought, that I'd moved beyond needing anything from them, but that was only partly true. Some part of me had always wanted them to see what they'd thrown away. Some part of me had been waiting for exactly this moment. I called my assistant and told her to clear my schedule for Christmas. I would accept the invitation. I would sit at their table. I would let them make their pitch, and then I would show them exactly who Sarah Hartwell had become. But what they didn't know was that I'd already discovered their real situation, and it was so much worse than they realized. After my father slowly, carefully handed my phone back to me with trembling fingers, after I'd taken the governor's call in the hallway, and assured him everything was fine, after I'd returned to find my family sitting in stunned silence around their half-eaten dinner, they attempted to regroup. My mother was the first to recover her composure. She stood smoothing her napkin with deliberate precision. "Well, that was certainly unexpected. Perhaps we should move to the sitting room for coffee." It was a performance of normalcy, as if the last 5 minutes hadn't just shattered their entire understanding of who I was. My father cleared his throat. "Actually, Catherine, I'd like a moment with Sarah. In my study." His voice had lost its earlier authority. He sounded uncertain, almost careful. I nodded. Of course. The study looked exactly as I remembered it: dark wood paneling, leather furniture, shelves of books that were more decorative than read. My father gestured to one of the chairs facing his desk, but I remained standing. A small power move, but an effective one. He hesitated, then moved to lean against his desk rather than sit behind it, trying to seem less formal, more approachable. "Sarah," he began, and I noted the shift from his earlier dismissiveness to something attempting warmth. "I realize we've had our differences over the years. The way things ended, perhaps we could have handled that better. Perhaps, could have. The non-apology taking no real responsibility. I want you to know that despite everything, you're still our daughter. We've thought about you over the years, wondered how you were doing. Not wondered enough to call to right to make any effort to find me." But I said nothing, just watched him with the same neutral expression I used in business negotiations. "That call from the governor," he continued, clearly struggling to process it. "That must mean you've done well for yourself. We're proud of you." The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. They weren't proud. They were shocked and recalculating. He shifted his weight, moving closer to the real purpose of this conversation. "The reason we invited you here tonight, Sarah, is because family is important. The Hartwell name means something. Legacy means something. And right now the family business is facing some temporary challenges." Temporary. As if a 60% stock decline and imminent bankruptcy were weather systems that would pass. "The market has been difficult," he continued, warming to his rehearsed pitch. "Some investments haven't performed as expected. We've had some client turnover. Nothing catastrophic, you understand, but it's put us in a position where we need to make some strategic decisions about capitalization." He was talking around the truth with the kind of euphemistic language that corporate executives use when they're lying to shareholders. "Now, with your background in finance, you understand these things. You understand that sometimes even strong companies need a capital injection to weather temporary downturns. We're looking for someone who understands the business world to invest in Hartwell Enterprises. Someone who could provide, say, $5 million in exchange for equity and a role in strategic planning. $5 million, said so casually as if it were a modest request between family members. This would be an opportunity for you, Sarah. A chance to be part of the family legacy, to take your rightful place in the business we've built over generations. My rightful place. The irony was staggering. They'd explicitly told me I had no place in this business, that I should focus on marriage and supporting others. Now suddenly there was a rightful place for me when they needed my money. The door opened and my mother entered as if on cue. This was clearly choreographed. "Robert, I hope you're explaining this properly," Catherine said, moving to stand beside my father in a united front. "Sarah, we know this is a lot to take in, but after everything we sacrificed to raise you, to give you a good childhood, surely you want to help your own family in their time of need." Everything they sacrificed. She said it like they'd given me anything beyond the basic legal requirements of not abandoning a child. As if 19 years of dismissal and restriction counted as sacrifice. "David has been working so hard," she continued. "But he's young and he needs support, family support. You could be part of something important here, something that matters." David appeared in the doorway, then, as if summoned by the mention of his name. He didn't speak, just stood there in his expensive suit, looking uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to object to their using him as emotional leverage. They surrounded me with their expectations, my father with his talk of legacy, my mother with her guilt about sacrifice, my brother with his silent presence. They'd constructed this moment carefully, this intervention designed to make me feel obligated, grateful for the opportunity to prove myself worthy. I remained silent, completely, utterly silent. I'd learned this technique in business negotiations. Silence makes people uncomfortable. When you don't respond, don't react, don't give them any feedback on whether their pitch is working, they start to fill the void. They reveal more than they intended. They show their real motivations. My father shifted his weight again. "We're talking about a secured investment, of course. Equity in a company with decades of history. This isn't charity we're asking for, it's a business opportunity." Catherine added, "And it would mean so much to us personally, Sarah, to have you back in the family fold, to repair what was broken." David finally spoke, his voice tight. "We really need this." There it was, the truth slipping through the careful phrasing. Need, not opportunity. Desperation, not strategy. I watched them, my face giving nothing away. In my mind, I was cataloging every manipulation tactic on display, the fake apologies designed to lower my defenses, the appeals to family loyalty I'd supposedly owe them, the framing of their desperation as my opportunity, the guilt-tripping about sacrifice, the pressure through David's presence, the attempt to make $5 million sound like a routine business transaction. They interpreted my silence as overwhelm, as submission, maybe even as gratitude. I could see it in how my mother's shoulders relaxed slightly, how my father's expression became more confident. They thought they were winning. And then I asked the one question that made their carefully rehearsed pitch collapse. Why me? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. My father's mouth opened and closed. He hadn't prepared for this. He'd prepared for gratitude, for questions about equity percentages and repayment terms, maybe even for negotiation. He hadn't prepared for me to question the fundamental premise of their request. "What do you mean, why you?" he finally managed. "Your family. You're our daughter. Family helps family. Blood is thicker than water." The clichés sounded hollow even as he spoke them. Blood is thicker than water. The same blood that hadn't mattered when they'd chosen David for everything, when they'd restricted my opportunities, when they'd let me walk out with $200 and never looked back. Catherine's face flushed. "What kind of question is that? After everything we gave you for 18 years, you've been selfish ever since. We raised you, fed you, clothed you, gave you every advantage." "Did you?" I asked calmly, because I remember it differently. Oh, here we go, my mother said, her voice sharp. The victim narrative. Sarah's sad story about how terrible we were. David made a sound, almost a laugh, but more desperate. He looked at our parents, then at me, and something in him just broke. Because we're desperate and you have money, he blurted out. Isn't that obvious? The company's failing, we're months from bankruptcy, and you apparently have millions. That's why you're here. Can we please stop pretending this is about family reconciliation? The silence that followed was absolute. My father turned to David with a look of fury. Catherine's face went pale. But David's honesty, born of exhaustion and stress, had shattered the careful facade they'd been maintaining. The pretense was gone. Well, I said quietly, at least one of you is being honest. I turned to my parents. You want to talk about family? Let's talk about family. Let's talk about how you celebrated David's C's while ignoring my straight A's. How you refused to sign permission forms for advanced classes because girls don't need that kind of pressure. How you made me decline being class president because women should support, not lead. You're being dramatic, my father interrupted. We encouraged both of you equally. You told a business associate that I wasn't important to the company's future when I was 13 years old. I heard you. His face went blank. He didn't even remember saying it. That casual dismissal of my existence had been so insignificant to him that it hadn't registered as memorable. Catherine stepped forward. Everything I did was for your own good, Sarah. I was preparing you for reality. The world isn't kind to women who try to do too much, who reach beyond their natural capabilities. I was protecting you from disappointment and failure. You were protecting yourself, I said, from having a daughter who might outshine your son. That's not true, she snapped. You were always difficult, always pushing boundaries, always questioning authority. Even as a child, you created drama and played the victim when you didn't get your way. I stared at her, genuinely stunned. She believed this. She had rewritten our entire history in her mind to make herself the patient mother dealing with a problematic daughter, rather than the insecure woman who'd systematically crushed her child's potential. I was 8 years old when I won the Mathematics Excellence Award, I said. You forgot to come to the ceremony because you were celebrating David passing a spelling test. How is that me being difficult? You're remembering it wrong, Robert said. We attended plenty of your events. Name one. He couldn't. The silence stretched. Catherine's voice went cold. This is exactly why we had concerns about you. This attitude, this resentment. We gave you a home, an education, everything you needed, and you've spent 19 years nursing grievances instead of being grateful. The gaslighting was so reflexive, so automatic, that I realized something crucial. They genuinely believed their own revised version of events. They'd told themselves this story so many times that it had become their truth. I wasn't the daughter they'd neglected and dismissed. I was the ungrateful child who'd rejected their generosity. They would never acknowledge what they'd done because they couldn't see it. I think we're done here, I said, standing. Wait, David said suddenly. He looked terrible, his face pale and drawn. Sarah, can I talk to you for a minute alone? Catherine's head whipped toward him. David, we're not finished discussing. Please, he said, and there was something in his voice that made me pause. Not the entitled, spoiled brother I remembered, but something desperate and frightened. I nodded. We stepped out into the hallway away from our parents. David glanced back at the study, then moved us further away into the library. His hands were shaking. I need to tell you something about Hale, he whispered. Richard Hale. He's been advising me for 3 years. But I know he's been using the company for something. Money laundering may be worse. I've signed things I shouldn't have. I'm in serious trouble, and if anyone finds out... He trailed off, looking at me with genuine fear. Not fear of me, but fear of something much bigger and more dangerous. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because you're the only person I know who might actually be able to help. And because, he swallowed hard, because I'm scared, really scared, and I don't know who else to turn to. Before I could respond, Catherine appeared in the doorway. What are you two discussing, David? Get back in here. We need to present a united front. But David had planted a seed. Something was very wrong, far beyond the family dynamics and financial desperation. There was real danger here, criminal activity that could destroy more than just the company. And for the first time in our lives, I saw my brother not as the favored son who'd gotten everything I deserved, but as someone drowning and desperately reaching for a lifeline. That conversation would happen sooner than I expected, and what he revealed would change everything. 2 days after Christmas, my assistant buzzed through on the intercom, her voice uncertain. Sarah, there's a David Hartwell here to see you. He says he's your brother. He doesn't have an appointment, and honestly, he looks rough. Security is asking if they should escort him out. I felt my stomach tighten. David at my office. He'd found me. Send him up, I said, and hold all my calls. When David walked into my office, I barely recognized him. The polished, suited figure from Christmas dinner was gone. He wore jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt. His hair was uncombed, his face unshaven, dark circles under bloodshot eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Sarah, he said, his voice hoarse. Thank you for seeing me. I wasn't sure you would. How did you find this address? Your company website. I couldn't call or email. I know my phone is being monitored. Maybe my email too. Possibly my car, which is why I took an Uber. He laughed, a brittle sound without humor. I'm probably being paranoid, but I can't take the chance. I gestured to the conference table in my office. Sit down. Tell me what's going on. He collapsed into a chair like someone who'd been holding himself upright through sheer willpower and had finally reached safety. For a long moment, he just sat there, hands covering his face. I've destroyed everything, he said finally. The company, the family, my own life. And the worst part is, I did it all myself. I was so stupid, so desperate to prove I could handle being CEO, that I let someone use me like a puppet. Richard Hale, I said. His head snapped up. You know about him? I know he's been advising you. I don't know the details. David took a shaky breath. 3 years ago, when I became CEO, I was drowning. I had no idea what I was doing. The board didn't trust me. Dad was constantly criticizing every decision. Mom kept pushing me to prove myself. I was failing, and I knew it. He paused, gathering himself. Then Hale showed up. He seemed like a godsend. Sophisticated, experienced, willing to mentor me. He helped me navigate board politics, taught me financial strategies, made me feel like I could actually do the job. For the first time, someone believed in me. I said nothing, letting him talk. About a year in, he introduced me to some private poker games. High stakes, important people. He said it was good for networking. I won the first few times, a lot. It felt incredible. But then I started losing, and I couldn't stop. I knew I should, but I couldn't. His hands were shaking now. Within 6 months, I owed $500,000. I was terrified. If Mom and Dad found out, if the board found out. Hale offered to help. He paid off my debts, all of them. He said we were friends, that successful people help each other. And then he owned you, I said quietly. Yes. David's voice cracked. He started asking me to approve certain contracts, technology, infrastructure purchases, international consulting fees, development projects. They all looked legitimate. The paperwork was professional. The amounts weren't suspicious individually. I signed everything he put in front of me because I trusted him, because I owed him. He pulled a folder from his bag with trembling hands and spread documents across the table. Invoices, contracts, payment authorizations, all bearing David's signature. 2 weeks ago, I was reviewing quarterly expenses and noticed something odd. One of these consulting firms, Titan Solutions International, I couldn't find any actual work they'd done for us. No deliverables, no communications, nothing. Just invoices and payments. His finger traced down a list. I started checking the others. Global Tech Ventures, Pacific Rim Advisors, Summit, Strategic Partners. I looked them up. They're all shell companies. They don't actually exist beyond registered addresses and websites. The services they supposedly provided to us never happened. How much money? I asked. $47 million over 18 months, flowing through our accounts to these shells, then disappearing. And I signed every authorization. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Money laundering. I didn't know, David said desperately. I swear to God I had no idea what I was signing. But that doesn't matter, does it? I'm the CEO. My signature is on everything. When this comes out, and it will come out, I'm going to federal prison. 15, maybe 20 years for money laundering conspiracy. He looked at me with hollow eyes. Mom and Dad will probably be charged too. Failure of oversight, breach of fiduciary duty. The company will be destroyed. Our family will lose everything. And I did this. Me. Because I was too weak and stupid to see what Hale was doing. I studied the documents, my mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just corporate malfeasance. This was sophisticated financial crime, the kind that attracted FBI attention and federal prosecutors. Why come to me? I asked. Why not hire a lawyer immediately? Because Hale is still watching. He checks in daily, asking about operations, making sure I'm not changing anything. If I suddenly hire a criminal defense attorney, he'll know I've discovered what's happening. And I don't know what he'll do if he thinks I'm a threat to his operation. David's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I'm an idiot, Sarah. I destroyed our family because I was too proud and too weak to admit I needed help. But Hale, this isn't just about revenge on us anymore. I've been researching these shell companies. They're connected to dozens of other businesses, other transactions. The money he's moving through our company, it's going to fund something bad. Drugs, weapons, I don't know. But innocent people are going to get hurt. He looked at me with something I'd never seen in my brother before, genuine moral clarity through the haze of his own culpability. I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know that. But you're the only person I know who understands both finance and technology enough to figure out what Hale's really doing. And you're the only person he doesn't know to watch. And if I didn't act fast, my family wouldn't be the only ones destroyed. Hale's network touched dozens of legitimate businesses. I looked at David sitting across from me, disheveled and desperate, and made a decision that had nothing to do with family loyalty. I'll help you, I said. But not to save the family business, not to protect Mom and Dad's reputation. I'm doing this because Hale is using your company to move money that's going to hurt people who have nothing to do with any of this. That stops now. David nodded, relief flooding his face. Whatever your reasons, I'll take it. Then here's how this works. You tell me everything. Every detail, no matter how embarrassing or incriminating. You've lied to yourself and everyone else for years. That ends today. Complete honesty, or I walk away and you can face the FBI alone. Over the next 3 hours, I learned more about my brother than I'd known in 38 years. He told me about the gambling addiction, how it had started as networking and evolved into compulsion. About nights he'd lost $100,000 and driven home thinking about crashing his car into a bridge abutment. About the shame of being the Hartwell heir who couldn't actually lead, who made decisions based on panic rather than strategy. He told me about the board meetings where he'd been so lost he'd just agreed with whoever spoke most confidently. About the contracts he'd approved without reading them because he was too proud to admit he didn't understand the terms. About 3 years of coasting on the family name while the company slowly bled out beneath him. And then he told me something I hadn't expected. I knew they treated you differently, he said, not meeting my eyes. Growing up, I knew. When they celebrated my C's and ignored your A's, when Mom wouldn't let you take advanced classes, when Dad talked about me inheriting everything. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't say anything because it benefited me. He finally looked up. I'm not asking you to forgive me for that. I'm just telling you the truth. I was a coward then, and I've been a coward ever since. This is the first time in my life I'm actually trying to do the right thing, even though it terrifies me. I felt something unexpected, not sympathy exactly, but recognition. We'd both been damaged by the same family, just in completely different ways. They'd dismissed me, which had forced me to become strong. They'd elevated him, which had prevented him from ever developing real strength. We were both casualties of Catherine and Robert's dysfunction. "Okay," I said. "Here's what we're going to do." I brought in help, but carefully. I hired Marcus Chen, a forensic accountant who'd previously worked for the SEC and now ran a discreet consulting firm. I also contacted James Riley, a former FBI white-collar crime investigator who'd retired early and now did private investigations. Both were people I'd worked with before, people who understood the need for absolute discretion. What they uncovered over the next 2 weeks was even more sophisticated than David had realized. Hale had constructed a maze of shell corporations across Massachusetts, Delaware, Nevada, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg. Each one had legitimate-looking registration documents, professional websites, and plausible business descriptions. The money moved through Hartwell Enterprises in transactions that were individually unremarkable but collectively devastating. "Look at this structure," Marcus explained, spreading out a network diagram across my conference table. "The money enters through what looks like legitimate consulting contracts. Hartwell pays these shells for services that are vague enough to be unchallengeable: strategic advisory, market analysis, international coordination. The shells then move the money through a series of transfers that cross jurisdictions, making it nearly impossible to trace." $47 million over 18 months, James added. "But it's designed so that no single transaction triggers reporting requirements. Everything's just under the threshold that would require additional scrutiny. This guy knows exactly what he's doing." "Can we prove it's criminal?" I asked. James grimaced. "That's the problem. Proving money laundering requires showing that the money came from illegal sources or was intended for illegal purposes. We can show the shell companies don't provide real services, but Hale can claim they do provide services, just intangible ones. Without insider testimony or evidence of the original criminal activity, this is going to be hard to prosecute." And that's when I called Samuel Vance. We met at his private residence rather than his office, away from any official channels. I laid out everything we'd discovered. Samuel listened in silence, his expression growing darker. "This is federal crime territory," he said finally. "FBI, possibly FinCEN. But you're right, without stronger evidence or testimony from someone inside Hale's network, building a prosecutable case will be difficult." "David's willing to testify about what he signed," I said. "But that only proves he was used, not what Hale was actually doing." Samuel thought for a moment. "I have contacts at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Good people. If we bring them something concrete, not just suspicious transactions, but evidence of intent, of Hale's knowledge and planning, they can move quickly. But we need more than we have now." The problem was Hale's paranoia. David reported that Hale checked in with him almost daily, ostensibly to discuss strategy, but really to ensure David wasn't deviating from the program. If David suddenly changed behavior, if he started asking questions or hesitating on new contracts, Hale would know something was wrong. "He's not stupid," David said during one of our strategy sessions. "If he thinks I'm a liability, either he disappears and we lose our chance to stop him, or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but we all understood. People who laundered tens of millions of dollars weren't usually squeamish about protecting their operations. We developed a careful plan. David would continue to appear cooperative and slightly incompetent, exactly what Hale expected. But he would also start documenting everything, recording conversations when legally possible, keeping detailed notes of meetings, saving every communication. "You need to act normal," I told David. "Stressed about the company's finances, yes, but not suspicious of Hale. He's your trusted advisor. You rely on him." "I can do that," David said. "God knows I've been pretending to know what I'm doing for 3 years. This is just a different kind of pretending." For the first time in his life, my brother was doing something genuinely difficult. Something that required courage rather than privilege. I watched him leave my office that day and realized he was finally growing up at 35, forced by circumstances into becoming someone real instead of someone performed. But gathering evidence wasn't enough. I needed Hale to incriminate himself directly in a way he couldn't deny. Getting Hale to incriminate himself required making him feel like he'd already won. I crafted my approach carefully. Through a business intermediary, I sent a message to Richard Hale requesting a meeting to discuss potential investment opportunities with Hartwell Enterprises. The message was deliberately vague but intriguing. I was a financial technology consultant with significant capital to invest, and I'd heard through industry channels that Hartwell Enterprises had some innovative international partnerships that might align with my interests. I positioned myself as someone doing due diligence before committing funds. Someone savvy enough to know the company had unusual consulting arrangements but potentially interested rather than suspicious. Someone who wanted to understand the full picture before making investment decisions. Hale responded within 3 hours. He was intrigued, his message carefully professional but with an undertone of eagerness. Of course, he'd be happy to discuss Hartwell Enterprises' strategic partnerships and growth opportunities. When would be convenient, I suggested my office on my territory, with my security, my recording equipment. He agreed immediately. The day before our meeting, I informed my assistant that I'd be recording the conversation for my records and to ensure I had his consent on tape at the beginning. This was Massachusetts, a two-party consent state, so I needed his explicit permission. I knew he'd agree. People like Hale were always confident they could control any conversation. He arrived exactly on time, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. He was 59, but looked younger with silver hair perfectly styled, and the kind of confidence that came from years of successfully manipulating people. "Ms. Hartwell," he said, extending his hand. "A pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard impressive things about Vance Tech Solutions." "Mr. Hale, thank you for coming." I gestured to the conference table. "Before we begin, I record all investment discussions for my records. Do I have your consent?" "Of course," he said smoothly. Transparency is essential in business relationships. I started the recording, stated the date and time, and confirmed his verbal consent. Then I let him talk. He laid out what he called his vision for expanding Hartwell Enterprises' international consulting division. He used impressive-sounding terminology: cross-border strategic advisory, international market penetration, global coordination services. Everything was vague enough to sound legitimate while meaning nothing specific. I let him build momentum, occasionally asking interested questions. Then I started probing. "I noticed some interesting partnerships in the recent quarterly reports," I said. "Titan Solutions International, for instance. What specific services do they provide?" For just a moment, something flickered in his expression. Then he recovered, launching into an explanation about strategic market analysis and coordination with international partners. "And Global Tech Ventures?" I asked. "Pacific Rim Advisors." His answers became more defensive, more elaborate. He was working harder to justify transactions that shouldn't need justification if they were legitimate. Then I shifted tactics, letting some of my own story bleed through. "I have to say, Mr. Hale, I understand the appeal of working with Hartwell Enterprises, despite their current challenges. My family and I have a complicated history. They dismissed me for years, never thought I'd amount to anything." His eyes sharpened with interest. "You're related to the Hartwells?" "Robert is my father," I said, "though we've been estranged for 19 years. Something changed in his demeanor then. The professional facade cracked, and underneath was something colder, more personal. "Then you understand," he said, leaning forward. "You understand what it's like when the Hartwells decide you're disposable." "Tell me," I said simply. And he did. His ego, his need to have someone appreciate the brilliance of his revenge, overrode his caution. "Your father destroyed my life 14 years ago without a second thought." Hale said, his voice tight with controlled anger. I made one mistake, one error in a complex international merger after 9 years of exceptional service. He didn't just fire me. He publicly humiliated me, destroyed my reputation, cost me my marriage and my children. I'm sorry that happened to you, I said, and meant it. Hale's revenge was monstrous, but my father's cruelty had planted the seeds. Are you? He studied me. Or do you understand I spent 2 years barely surviving? Then I decided to rebuild myself to become someone who could return the favor. And when I learned that David Hartwell, incompetent, privileged, desperate, had been made CEO, I saw the perfect opportunity. Opportunity for what? To destroy them the way they destroyed me. I'm simply returning the favor with interest. His smile was cold. And the beautiful irony is they'll destroy themselves. Your brother signed every document willingly. When the authorities finally investigate, and they will, David will face federal prison. Your parents will be charged with oversight failures. The company will collapse. And I'll have moved on untraceable. You're using their company for money laundering, I said quietly. He didn't even try to deny it. I'm using their incompetence and arrogance against them. Your brother never questioned anything I put in front of him. He was so desperate to appear competent that he signed authorizations for $47 million in transactions without understanding what they really were. And the money moves through channels that will never be traced back to me. The shells are registered in jurisdictions that don't cooperate with U.S. authorities. By the time anyone untangles the structure, I'll have disappeared. But the Hartwells, they'll spend years in litigation and prison. He leaned back satisfied. Your father thought he could discard me without consequences. He was wrong. I had it all on tape confession to fraud admission of money laundering conspiracy against the Hartwells. But I knew recordings could be challenged in court, dismissed as entrapment or edited manipulation. I needed more. It's an impressive strategy, I said carefully, but I'm curious if I were to invest, how would you ensure my capital isn't caught up in whatever happens when this inevitably comes to light? Because by then the infrastructure will be completely restructured, he said, warming to the topic. New shells, new channels, new partnerships. What's happening now is just phase 1. With additional capital, we could expand significantly. And that's exactly what would happen at the emergency board meeting I'd arranged. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday, ostensibly to discuss potential investment opportunities. David had arranged it at my instructions, citing that a significant investor wanted to present a proposal to the full board. I arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio and projecting the calm confidence of someone about to write a very large check. The conference room at Hartwell Enterprises was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits: dark wood oil paintings of stern ancestors, a massive table that could seat 20. The board members filtered in 9 people, including my parents and David. I recognized a few from my childhood, longtime business associates of my father's who'd watched me grow up invisible. They looked at me with visible confusion, clearly trying to place how Robert Hartwell's disappointing daughter had become relevant enough to warrant an emergency board meeting. My mother's face when she saw me was priceless. She'd been expecting this meeting to be about David's latest crisis management strategy. Seeing me sitting calmly at the table, dressed in a power suit that probably cost more than she'd ever imagined I could afford, shattered her entire understanding of the situation. "Sarah," she said, her voice uncertain, "what are you doing here?" "I'm the potential investor David mentioned," I said evenly. "I have some questions about the company's strategic partnerships before making any commitments." Robert's expression flickered between hope and suspicion. Hope that I'd actually come to save them, suspicion that I had some other agenda. Richard Hale entered last, impeccably dressed and radiating confidence. He saw me and didn't even flinch, just nodded politely as he took his seat next to David. He thought he knew what was happening here. He thought I was either legitimately interested in investing or playing some petty revenge game with my family. He had no idea what was actually about to happen. David sat at the head of the table in his role as CEO. He looked terrible pale, sweating despite the air conditioning, his hands trembling slightly as he organized papers in front of him. But when his eyes met mine briefly, I saw determination underneath the fear. The board chair, Marcus Thornton, called the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss a potential significant investment opportunity. Ms. Hartwell has expressed interest in understanding our current strategic partnerships and growth initiatives before making any commitments." "Before we get to that," David said, his voice surprisingly steady, "I'd like Richard Hale to present his quarterly report on our international consulting partnerships. I think it's relevant to the investment discussion." Hale stood smoothly, activating a presentation on the screen. Graphs, charts, impressive-looking metrics about international strategic growth. "As you can see," Hale began, "our expansion into global consulting services has created significant new revenue streams. Our partnerships with firms like Titan Solutions International Global Tech Ventures and Pacific Rim Advisors have positioned us to compete in international markets we previously couldn't access." He spoke for 5 minutes using impressive-sounding jargon that meant absolutely nothing. Then I interrupted. "Mr. Hale, can you explain the actual services provided by Titan Solutions International?" He paused, smile still in place. "Titan provides strategic market analysis and coordination for our European expansion initiatives." "Specifically, what analysis have they delivered?" "Various market reports, competitive assessments, regulatory guidance." His tone was patient, as if explaining to someone who didn't understand business complexities. "Can you show us one of these reports?" A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "The materials are proprietary and confidential to the consulting relationship." "What about Global Tech Ventures?" I asked. "What specific services do they provide? International Technology Infrastructure Consulting, Pacific Rim Advisors, Asia-Pacific Market Coordination, Summit Strategic Partners." The board members were exchanging glances, now starting to notice the pattern. These were all companies they'd approved contracts with, but no one had ever actually questioned what they did. Hale's confidence was cracking. "Ms. Hartwell, I'm not sure what you're implying, but these are all legitimate business partnerships that have been thoroughly vetted and approved by this board." "Are they?" I opened my laptop, connected it to the presentation screen. "Because I've done some research on these companies. Titan Solutions International is registered to a virtual office in the Cayman Islands. Global Tech Ventures' website was created 3 years ago and hasn't been updated since. Pacific Rim Advisors lists no employees, no physical office, no actual consultants." "This is absurd," Hale said, his voice sharp. "You're cherry-picking minor administrative details to undermine legitimate business relationships." "Then let's discuss what you told me in my office last week." I clicked play on the audio file. Hale's voice filled the boardroom, clear and damning. "Your father destroyed my life 14 years ago without a second thought. I made one mistake after 9 years of exceptional service. He didn't just fire me. He publicly humiliated me, destroyed my reputation, cost me my marriage and my children." My father's face went white. The recording continued. "I'm simply returning the favor with interest. And the beautiful irony is they'll destroy themselves. Your brother signed every document willingly. When the authorities finally investigate, and they will, David will face federal prison." The room erupted. Board members talking over each other, my mother standing and demanding to know what was happening. My father staring at Hale with dawning horror. "You're using their company for money laundering," my recorded voice said. "I'm using their incompetence and arrogance against them. Your brother never questioned anything I put in front of him. He signed authorizations for $47 million in transactions without understanding what they really were." Catherine's voice cut through the chaos, shrill and furious. "This is fabricated. She's manipulating." Then David stood. The room went silent. My brother, who'd spent his entire life taking the easy path, who'd never stood up for anything difficult or uncomfortable, looked at the board and said clearly, "It's true. All of it. I signed documents approving payments to shell companies. I didn't know they were shells at the time, but that doesn't matter. I was negligent and manipulated, and I've put this company in serious legal jeopardy." His voice cracked but held. "I'll testify. I'll cooperate fully with federal investigators. I'll take responsibility for what I've done." Catherine screamed, "David, sit down and shut up. Don't say another word." Robert looked like he was having a stroke, his face purple, one hand clutching his chest. Hale sat completely frozen, his confidence shattered. He was staring at me with something between fury and disbelief. He'd planned everything, perfectly manipulated everyone masterfully. And his perfect revenge had just collapsed because he'd underestimated the daughter no one had ever considered a threat. I nodded to building security who'd been waiting outside. "Please escort Mr. Hale from the premises. He's no longer welcome here." As they moved toward him, I addressed the board. "The FBI's Financial Crimes Division has been briefed on this situation. They'll be contacting you within 24 hours. I'd recommend you all retain counsel immediately." But the fallout from that exposure was only beginning, and my family's real reckoning was still to come. The news broke within 48 hours. I'd worked with the FBI to ensure that innocent employees at Hartwell Enterprises were protected, that clients understood the money laundering operation was separate from the company's legitimate services, that vendors wouldn't be caught in the legal fallout. But there was no protecting my family's reputation. The Boston Business Journal ran it first, prominent family business embroiled in money laundering investigation. By evening, every business publication in New England had picked up the story. By morning, it had spread to the national outlets. The articles were devastating in their detail. Federal investigators were examining nearly $50 million in suspicious transactions. The CEO had admitted to signing documents without proper oversight. A former CFO was being sought for questioning regarding an elaborate shell company scheme. The Hartwell family pillars of Boston's elite community for 3 generations were now suspected of either criminal negligence or active participation in financial crimes. I watched it unfold from my office, tracking the coverage with a strange mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. This was what I'd wanted, wasn't it? For them to face consequences. For their carefully constructed image to shatter. The social collapse was swift and total. Within 3 days, both my parents received letters from the Brookfield Country Club. Their memberships were suspended pending the resolution of current legal matters. The letter was polite, bureaucratic, and absolutely final. They'd been members for 35 years. My father had served on the golf committee. My mother had chaired the annual gala twice. Now they were persona non grata. Catherine received calls from 3 charitable boards asking her to step down immediately, not to take a leave of absence, not to temporarily recuse herself from decisions, to step down. Organizations she'd given hundreds of hours to, events she'd organized, causes she'd championed, all wanted distance from the Hartwell name as quickly as possible. Friends stopped returning calls. People my parents had socialized with for decades suddenly had scheduling conflicts for every invitation. The elaborate network of social connections that had defined their existence for years simply evaporated. I learned all this through Samuel Vance, who was monitoring the situation, and through a few remaining contacts who fed me information. I didn't reach out to my family. I wasn't ready for that yet. David was removed as CEO by emergency board vote 3 days after the exposure. The board installed an interim CEO, an experienced turnaround specialist who immediately began damage control. David's official title became Former CEO Cooperating with Federal Investigation. He moved back into the family mansion. Not because he wanted to return to his childhood home at 35, but because he'd mortgaged his condo to pay gambling debts and couldn't afford rent anywhere else. All his assets were frozen pending the investigation. He was, for the first time in his privileged life, completely broke. The mansion became a pressure cooker of recrimination and blame. Catherine blamed Robert for everything. "You hired that monster 14 years ago. You brought him into our lives. If you'd just been more careful, if you'd checked his references more thoroughly, none of this would have happened." Robert fired back with equal venom. "I hired a competent CFO. You're the one who pushed David into the CEO position when he clearly wasn't ready. You insisted he take over immediately instead of bringing in someone experienced. This disaster is your creation." They fought in rooms that had once hosted elegant parties, their voices echoing through halls that had always maintained the illusion of perfect family harmony. The staff heard everything, and inevitably some of it leaked to people who leaked it to me. David, to his credit, didn't deflect. "This is my fault," he told them during one particularly vicious argument. "I signed the documents. I didn't do my due diligence. I was weak and stupid and got manipulated. You can blame each other all you want, but I'm the one who destroyed this family." It was the most honest thing I'd ever heard him say, and it was closer to the truth than anything his parents would admit. Their dysfunction, hidden for decades behind wealth and social performance, was now on full display. The facade had cracked completely, revealing the rot underneath. They'd never actually been a functional family. They'd just been wealthy enough to hide it. I found myself watching this collapse from a distance, with complicated emotions. Part of me felt vindicated. They were experiencing rejection, isolation, judgment. Everything I'd felt at 19 when they'd cast me out. They were learning what it felt like when your community turned its back on you, when people you thought were friends revealed themselves to be fair-weather acquaintances. This was justice, in a way. Not legal justice that would come later with the investigation, but social and emotional justice. They were finally facing consequences for their cruelty, their arrogance, their fundamental hollowness. But another part of me felt something unexpected: pity. Not for their legal troubles. Those were deserved. David had been negligent at best, criminally stupid at worst. My parents had failed in their oversight responsibilities. They'd earned every bit of the investigation and whatever charges might follow. But I felt pity for how completely their identity had been wrapped up in external validation. Watching them now stripped of their social standing, I could see they literally didn't know who they were. They'd defined themselves entirely by what others thought of them, by their position in a community that valued appearance over substance. Without the country club, the charity boards, the social calendar, they were lost. They'd never built anything real underneath the facade. They'd never developed identities based on genuine values or authentic relationships. They were hollow people playing hollow roles, and now the stage had collapsed beneath them. My mother had spent decades cultivating an image of refined elegance and social grace. Without that image, she didn't know how to exist. My father had built his entire sense of self around business success and social status. Without those markers, he was just an old man who'd made terrible decisions. They'd never developed the kind of inner strength that comes from surviving hardship, from building something from nothing, from knowing yourself beyond what others think of you. I had that strength. I'd been forced to develop it at 19 when I left with $200 and nothing else. They'd never had to build it because they'd never faced real adversity until now. And as they spiraled, they all turned to the one person they'd spent decades dismissing, desperate and humiliated. Catherine arrived at my office on a Monday morning unannounced. My assistant buzzed through uncertainty in her voice. "Your mother is here. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent." I almost said to send her away. Almost. But curiosity won out. When Catherine walked through my door, I barely recognized her. She'd aged a decade in 2 weeks. Her hair, always perfectly styled, was pulled back in a simple clip. Her clothes, though still expensive, lacked her usual meticulous coordination. Most striking was her face. The careful makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion and stress etched into every line. "Sarah," she said, her voice tight. "Thank you for seeing me." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. She sat with the same rigid posture I remembered from childhood, but something in it seemed brittle now, like she might shatter if touched. "I need your help," she said without preamble. "The family needs your help. This scandal is destroying everything we've built over 3 generations. The company's reputation, our social standing, everything." I waited. "You have the resources to fix this. A significant capital investment would stabilize Hartwell Enterprises, show the community that the family is still viable." You could help restore our name, our reputation." "Why would I do that?" I asked. Her eyes flashed with something like the old Catherine, the imperious mother who'd always believed she was right. "Because you've done well for yourself based on the foundation we gave you. The education, the upbringing, the values we instilled. You owe us. Family takes care of family." The foundation they gave me. The values they instilled. She genuinely believed this. She'd rewritten history so thoroughly in her own mind that she actually thought she'd provided me with some kind of advantage. "I don't owe you anything," I said quietly. Her composure cracked. "Please, I'm begging you. This is destroying us. We're losing everything." "I lost everything at 19, I replied. "You watched me leave with $200 and never called. Never wrote. Never cared if I was alive or dead." "That was different." "How?" She had no answer. She couldn't see it, couldn't acknowledge the parallel. She was sorry for the consequences she was facing now, but not for the actions that had led here. Not for what she'd done to me or to David or to anyone else. I felt something shift inside me then. Not forgiveness, not even anger anymore. Just clarity. "I'll think about it," I said, which was more generous than she deserved. "But I'm not promising anything." She left and I felt strangely empty rather than vindicated. My father came to my home 3 nights later. It was nearly 10 p.m. when my doorbell rang. I almost didn't answer, but something made me check the security camera. Robert stood on my doorstep, swaying slightly, his tie loosened and his hair disheveled. I opened the door. He reeked of expensive scotch. "Sarah," he said, his words slightly slurred. "I'm sorry, I know it's late. I needed to tell you something, before it's too late." I let him in, made him coffee he didn't drink, and watched him collapse into my armchair with his face in his hands. "I knew," he said finally. "About the trust fund. Catherine manipulated David's trusteeship, used your inheritance to bail out the company, took those ridiculous management fees. I knew, and I said nothing." He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "It was easier to sacrifice you than confront her. Easier to let her control everything than stand up for what was right. I chose the path of least resistance every single time, and you paid the price." His honesty was devastating because it was real. This wasn't a performance or manipulation. This was my father finally telling the complete truth. "I failed you," he continued, his voice breaking. "I failed David by never preparing him for real responsibility. I failed myself by never becoming the man I should have been. I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't deserve anything from you. I just wanted you to know that I've always known. The guilt has been eating me alive for 19 years. He wasn't asking to be saved. He was asking to be seen, to be understood as the weak, flawed man he actually was, rather than the authoritative figure he'd pretended to be. I sat with him for 2 hours. We talked about things we'd never discussed: his own father's cruelty, his marriage to Catherine, his regrets. When he left, stumbling slightly as he called an Uber, something in my chest that had been locked tight for decades had loosened slightly. David came last, showing up at my office on a Friday afternoon. He looked different. Thinner, with shorter hair and cheaper clothes. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a button-down shirt. He looked like someone trying to figure out how to exist without money for the first time in his life. "I'm not here to ask you to save the company," he said immediately, "or to bail me out financially. I'm getting what I deserve legally. The FBI gave me immunity for cooperation, but I'm still facing civil suits from investors. I'll probably be paying off settlements for the rest of my life." "Then why are you here?" "I want to know how you did it. How you survived those first years with nothing. How you built something real when you had no connections, no safety net, no support." He met my eyes. "I'm about to go through what you went through at 19. No job, no one in the industry will hire me. No money, everything's tied up in legal proceedings. A name that's toxic in professional circles. I'm starting from less than zero. His hands were steady now, no longer shaking like they had been at Christmas. I know I don't deserve your help. I know I benefited from everything that hurt you. But you're the only person I know who's actually built something from nothing based on real ability rather than inherited privilege. And I need to learn how to do that, or I'm going to destroy what's left of my life. For the first time, I saw my brother as fully human. Not the spoiled rival or the weak heir, but a damaged man trying finally to grow into someone real. But before I could decide how to respond to any of them, I learned the truth that would change everything I thought I knew. The truth came 2 days later during a follow-up conversation with my father. He'd called sober this time and asked if we could meet. Not at my office or my home, but at a neutral location. We chose a quiet cafe in Cambridge, the kind of place where no one would recognize us or care about our business. Robert looked better than he had when drunk on my doorstep, but older somehow. The weight of everything that had happened had settled into his features permanently. I need to tell you something about Catherine, he said after we'd ordered coffee neither of us would drink. Something that explains a lot, though it doesn't excuse anything. I waited. Your mother wasn't born a Hartwell. She was adopted. The words hung between us. I'd never known this, never even suspected. Catherine's biological parents died in a car accident when she was 12 years old. No other family, no one to take her in. Your grandfather, William, knew her father slightly through business connections. When he learned what had happened, he and your grandmother decided to adopt her. Robert stared into his coffee cup. They gave her everything. The Hartwell name, education opportunities, love. William treated her exactly like his own daughter, but Catherine always felt like an outsider. She once told me in a rare moment of vulnerability early in our marriage that she spent her entire adolescence terrified someone would look at her and see the adopted girl who didn't really belong. I tried to process this. My mother, who'd spent my entire childhood enforcing rigid ideas about family legacy and bloodlines, wasn't blood herself. When we married, she thought she'd finally secured her place. She'd married William's son. She was truly a Hartwell now, not by adoption, but by marriage. And then she gave him a grandson. Robert's voice grew quieter. David was proof that she belonged, that her contribution to the family line mattered. And then grandfather left his estate primarily to me, I said slowly, understanding dawning. When William's will was read, Catherine was devastated. Not about the money, about what it meant. William had chosen his biological granddaughter over everything else. He'd stated explicitly that you showed uncommon wisdom and strength of character. To Catherine, that felt like a rejection of everything she'd tried to build proof that blood really did matter more than she'd convinced herself it didn't. The pieces clicked into place with painful clarity. Every restriction Catherine had placed on me, every time she'd praised David's mediocrity over my excellence, every limitation and dismissal, it hadn't been about traditional gender roles or family hierarchy. It had been about terror. She was afraid, I said. Terrified, Robert confirmed. Terrified that if you succeeded, if you proved to be as brilliant as William believed, people would compare you and see that the adopted daughter-in-law's son couldn't match the biological granddaughter. Terrified that the family would regret choosing David, would regret that she'd ever been brought into the Hartwell line. So she tried to eliminate the comparison by ensuring I never got the chance to succeed. She destroyed you to save herself from her own insecurity. Robert finally looked at me. It doesn't excuse what she did, but it explains it. She wasn't evil. She was wounded and terrified, and she made you pay the price for her pain. I sat with this revelation, feeling it reshape my understanding of my entire childhood. Catherine hadn't hated me. She'd been afraid of me, afraid of what my success would mean about her own worth. It didn't make the damage hurt less, but it made it comprehensible in a way it hadn't been before. There's more, Robert said. When your grandfather was dying, he had a series of conversations with Samuel Vance that I only learned about much later. He knew what Catherine might do. He understood that his son me was too weak to stand up to her. He predicted with painful accuracy how the family might fail you. The deathbed promise, I said, remembering what Vance had told me months ago when he'd revealed the trust fund manipulation. More than that. William left detailed instructions with Vance. If the family cast you aside if they failed to honor his will and his wishes for your future, Vance was to find you. He was to ensure you understood your grandfather's true faith in you. He was to reveal Catherine's background if it became relevant to understanding her actions. And he was to... Robert paused. He was to give you something when the time was right. What? A letter. One you were never meant to read until you were strong enough to understand it. Until you'd proven to yourself what William always knew, that your worth had nothing to do with whether this family recognized it. My throat tightened. Does Vance still have it? He's been waiting for the right moment. He told me recently that he thinks you're finally ready. I thought about everything that had happened. The years of struggle building Vance Tech from nothing, helping expose Hale's criminal operation, watching my family's facade crumble. I'd spent 19 years proving I didn't need them, that I was worth more than they'd ever acknowledged. And all along, my grandfather had been protecting me. Not by preventing the pain, he couldn't do that, but by ensuring I'd have what I needed when I was ready to receive it. I need to see Vance, I said. Robert nodded. I know, Sarah, Thank you for hearing me out. About all of this. You didn't have to. We parted on the sidewalk outside the cafe, and I watched my father walk away, a broken man, trying finally to be honest about the ways he'd failed. But my mind was already on what came next. And there was still one more letter, one I'd never been meant to read until I was ready to understand it. Before I went to see Samuel Vance and read my grandfather's letter, I made another decision. One that would determine not just my future, but my family's as well. I called an emergency meeting with the Hartwell Enterprises board. They gathered in the same conference room where I'd exposed Hale 3 weeks earlier. The interim CEO was there, along with the remaining board members. My parents attended in their roles as minority shareholders. David was conspicuously absent. He'd been banned from company premises pending the FBI investigation's conclusion. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. Hartwell Enterprises will file for bankruptcy within 90 days without significant capital injection, I stated, distributing financial projections my team had prepared. The Hale scandal destroyed client confidence. Your debt service obligations exceed current revenue. The company is insolvent. Marcus Thornton. The board chair looked at the numbers with resignation. We're aware of the situation. Several potential investors have expressed interest. No one serious, I interrupted. I've made inquiries. The investors circling are vultures looking to acquire assets at liquidation prices. They'll strip the company, sell the pieces, and leave your employees jobless. I paused, letting that sink in. I'm prepared to make one offer. $8 million in capital injection in exchange for majority ownership and operational control. The terms are non-negotiable. I laid out the structure. I would acquire 51% through a combination of purchasing existing shares at fair market value and capital injection. My parents would retain 25% in non-voting shares, enough to maintain dividend income but zero decision-making power. David would retain 5% conditional on completing addiction treatment and testifying fully against Hale. The remaining 19% would stay with current minority investors. You're asking us to give you control of a company that's been in your family for 3 generations, one board member said carefully. I'm offering to save a company that's weeks from bankruptcy. Control isn't being given, it's being earned through capital investment when no one else will take the risk. Robert sat silent, his face unreadable. Catherine looked like she might be sick. The board voted 40 minutes later. 7 in favor, 2 abstentions. No one voted against, they couldn't afford to. The legal restructuring took 3 months. Lawyers drafted shareholder agreements, filed corporate amendments, restructured debt obligations. I invested not just the $8 million I'd committed, but an additional $2 million to ensure adequate working capital. When the paperwork was finally executed, I became chairman and CEO of Hartwell Enterprises, the family company that had explicitly told me I'd never lead anything. The business my father had casually dismissed me from at age 13. The legacy my mother had insisted belonged only to men. I didn't celebrate. I didn't make speeches about vindication or justice. I simply went to work. My first action was firing 3 senior executives who'd enabled David's mismanagement through either incompetence or willful blindness. I brought in my own CFO, James Wu, who'd worked with me on security protocols for years and understood financial integrity at a cellular level. I renegotiated predatory vendor contracts that David had signed without reading. I restructured the company's service offerings, pivoting toward financial technology integration and risk management consulting areas where I actually had expertise and competitive advantage. I hired a new leadership team based on competence rather than connections. My VP of operations was a woman who'd worked her way up from customer service. My head of technology was a brilliant analyst who'd never finished college but could code circles around MIT graduates. Hartwell Enterprises would survive, but it would be completely transformed into something I could respect. The company my grandfather had built, that my father had maintained, that David had nearly destroyed it, would become something new, something earned rather than inherited. And my parents had to watch all of it. They had to watch me walk into that boardroom, the same room where my father had once dismissed my existence as irrelevant to the company's future, and command respect from people twice my age. They had to watch me make decisions in minutes that were smarter than ones they'd deliberated over for weeks. They had to watch their son, the golden child, who was supposed to inherit everything, working an entry-level position in data analysis, because that's where I'd agreed he could start. David had asked for that to his credit. "I need to learn the business from the ground up," he'd said. "The right way. Not as the boss's son, but as someone who has to earn every promotion." I'd agreed, and I'd made it clear to the team he got no special treatment. He earned his way up, or he didn't advance. Several employees who'd been passed over for promotion under David's leadership now managed teams. Some of them were his direct supervisors. The humiliation wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no confrontations, no public shaming. It was quiet, constant, and complete. Catherine had to accept dividend checks signed by the daughter she'd tried to erase. Robert had to read quarterly reports detailing how much better the company performed under my leadership than it ever had under his. They had to attend shareholder meetings where I presented strategies they couldn't comprehend using expertise they'd never imagined I'd develop. They had to live with the knowledge that the daughter they'd thrown away with $200 had saved them. Not out of love, not out of obligation, not even out of forgiveness, but because I was better than they'd ever been, and I could afford to be merciful in ways they never had been with me. My revenge wasn't destruction. It was transformation. I took everything they valued, legacy, control, the family business, and made it mine through competence they couldn't match. And then I let them watch powerless as I succeeded spectacularly at the very thing they'd insisted I could never do. But saving the company was only business. The real healing required something far more difficult. The real work began the day after I became CEO. I walked into Hartwell Enterprises at 7 a.m. before most employees arrived and spent 3 hours reviewing every active client contract, every revenue stream, every operational process. What I found was a company that had been coasting on legacy relationships and outdated business models for a decade. That ended immediately. I called a company-wide meeting for that afternoon. Nearly 200 employees packed into the main conference space, most of them anxious about what the new CEO, the one who'd exposed the scandal, would say. "Hartwell Enterprises is going to survive," I told them, "but it's going to change completely. We're pivoting from traditional business consulting into financial technology consulting and security. This is where the market is moving, and it's where we can offer genuine competitive advantage." I explained that I'd be leveraging relationships from my other company, Vance Tech, to bring in clients who needed sophisticated financial risk analysis and fraud prevention. Clients who would never have worked with the old Hartwell Enterprises, but would work with a company I led. "Some of you will need retraining for these new service lines. We'll provide that. Some of your roles will change. We'll work with you on transitions, and some of you might decide this isn't the right fit anymore. We'll provide fair severance. But for those who stay, I promise you this, you'll be evaluated on performance and results, not politics or who you know. Within 6 months, we'd signed contracts with 3 major banks for fraud detection consulting. Within 8 months, we'd landed a contract with a government agency for financial system security review. Within a year, our revenue exceeded what it had been before the scandal. The business press noticed. The Boston Business Journal ran a feature, From Scandal to Success: How New Leadership Saved a Legacy Company. Forbes included Hartwell Enterprises in a piece about corporate turnarounds. Industry publications interviewed me about the transformation strategy. I declined most media requests, but I made sure the coverage focused on the team I'd built, rather than any personal vindication narrative. This wasn't about me proving my family wrong. This was about creating something genuinely valuable. The cultural transformation was more important than the financial one. I spent the first month conducting one-on-one meetings with every manager and director in the company. I asked 3 questions. What do you actually do here? What should you be doing? What's preventing you from doing it? The answers revealed a dysfunctional organization where people had been promoted based on tenure or personal relationships rather than competence, where talented employees were stuck in roles far below their capabilities because no one had bothered to evaluate their actual skills, where good ideas died because there was no mechanism for communicating them upward. I restructured everything. I instituted transparent promotion criteria. If you wanted to advance to senior analyst, these were the competencies you needed to demonstrate. If you wanted to become a director, here was the track record of results required. No more mysterious decisions made behind closed doors based on who played golf with whom. I created whistleblower protections that actually meant something. Employees could report problems, unethical behavior, safety concerns, harassment through multiple channels, all protected from retaliation. I'd seen too many organizations where people stayed silent because speaking up meant career suicide. And I launched mentorship programs specifically for women and people from non-traditional backgrounds. I remembered how Samuel Vance's belief in me had changed my life. Every talented person deserved someone who saw their potential and invested in developing it. Within the first year, 3 women were promoted to senior leadership positions. 2 employees without college degrees advanced to management based purely on demonstrated competence. The company went from being known as an old boys club to being ranked as one of the best places to work in New England. But the most meaningful changes were individual. Jennifer Morrison had been an administrative assistant for 15 years. On paper, she scheduled meetings and managed calendars. In reality, I discovered she'd been doing sophisticated financial analysis that her previous bosses had taken credit for. She'd taught herself advanced Excel and statistical modeling because she was bored with her assigned work. I promoted her to Director of Strategic Analysis and tripled her salary. Marcus Chen had been passed over for promotion 4 times under David's leadership, despite consistently delivering the best client results in his division. His manager, a college friend of David's, had blocked his advancement because Marcus had once disagreed with him in a meeting. I fired that manager and promoted Marcus to vice president. Rachel Singh had revolutionary ideas about improving client onboarding processes, but had never been allowed to implement them because that's not how we do things here. I gave her a team and 6 months to redesign the entire system. Her new process reduced onboarding time by 40% and increased client satisfaction scores by 32%. Each of these corrections sent a message that rippled through the entire organization: the old way was over. Worth would be recognized. Talent would be developed. Politics and nepotism were finished. Employees who'd been working in fear and frustration under the old regime began to thrive. People brought forward ideas they'd been sitting on for years. Productivity increased not because I demanded longer hours, but because people were finally doing work that matched their capabilities, and they could see a fair path to advancement. David watched all of this from his entry-level position in data analysis. To his credit, he never complained, never asked for special treatment. He came in early, stayed late, and slowly proved he could actually do the work when he wasn't coasting on privilege. His supervisor, a woman half his age who'd been an intern when he was CEO, gave him fair but demanding feedback. He took it without defensiveness. He was learning finally what it meant to earn something. Hartwell Enterprises was becoming something I could actually be proud of. Not because it bore my family's name, but because it embodied values that mattered: competence, fairness, genuine excellence. But there was still one relationship that needed addressing, the most painful one of all. 6 months into my tenure as CEO, I decided it was time to address what I'd been avoiding. I sent Catherine a formal invitation to meet at my office. Not a request, not a suggestion. An invitation that made it clear this was happening on my terms in my space at my chosen time. She arrived exactly on time, dressed impeccably as always, though the strain of the past month showed in the tightness around her eyes. She walked into my office with her shoulders back, her chin up, clearly expecting some kind of attack or ultimatum. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Thank you for coming." She sat rigid and defensive. "What is this about Sarah?" "It's about the truth," I said. "All of it. Dad told me something recently that changed my understanding of everything." A flicker of fear crossed her face. She knew what was coming. "You were adopted," I said simply, "when you were 12, after your parents died." The color drained from her face. For a long moment she said nothing, just stared at me with something between shock and terror. "Who told you that?" she finally whispered. "Dad. He thought I needed to understand why you did what you did." Catherine's hands gripped the arms of her chair. It's not relevant. It was 50 years ago. It has nothing to do with—" "It has everything to do with it," I interrupted gently. "I know why you did what you did, Mom. I understand you were protecting yourself from pain you'd carried since childhood. You were terrified that I would prove blood mattered more than you'd convinced yourself it didn't. That if I succeeded, it would confirm your worst fear, that you never really belonged." Her carefully maintained composure began to crack. Her lips trembled. Her eyes filled with tears she'd probably been holding back for decades. "But understanding your pain doesn't erase mine," I continued. "Understanding why you hurt me doesn't undo the damage. It explains it, but it doesn't excuse it." And then Catherine did something I'd never seen her do in 38 years. She broke down completely. The tears came first, then the shaking, then the words pouring out in a torrent she couldn't control. "You have no idea what it was like," she said, her voice raw. "I was 12 years old when my parents died. Car accident. One moment I had a family, the next I had nothing. No aunts, no uncles, no grandparents. Just me alone in the world." She wiped at her tears with shaking hands. "Your grandfather took me in. He and your grandmother, they were so kind. They gave me everything, this beautiful home education, the Hartwell name. They treated me like their own daughter. But I always knew I wasn't really theirs." "Grandfather loved you," I said. "Did he? Or did he pity me?" Her voice cracked. "I spent every day of my adolescence terrified someone would look at me and see the charity case, the girl who didn't really belong. I tried so hard to be perfect, to prove I deserved to be a Hartwell. I learned all the right manners, wore all the right clothes, said all the right things." She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. "And then I married Robert. I thought that would finally make it real. I wasn't the adopted daughter anymore, I was the wife. And when I gave birth to David, I thought, this is it. This is proof I belong. I've given the Hartwell family an heir, a true heir with Hartwell blood." "But then Grandfather left most of his estate to me," I said quietly. Catherine's face twisted with pain. "When his will was read, when I heard him describe you uncommon wisdom and strength of character, I felt like I'd been slapped. All those years trying to prove I deserved my place, and he chose you. His biological granddaughter, the real Hartwell." "That's not what it meant. That's exactly what it meant." Her voice rose, desperate. "Don't you understand? If you succeeded, if you proved to be as brilliant as William believed, everyone would know. They'd know that biology mattered, that real blood mattered. They'd know that I was just the adopted girl who never should have been given the Hartwell name. She pressed her hands to her face. When you were born, you were so bright, so confident, so naturally gifted. You reminded me of William in ways David never did, and I was terrified. Terrified that people would compare you and see that my son, my contribution to the Hartwell line, couldn't match his grandfather's genes. So you tried to hide me, I said, to limit me. I tried to protect myself, she whispered. Every time you achieved something, it felt like proof that I'd never really belonged. Every time you were smarter than David, it felt like confirmation that adopted blood was inferior to real blood. I know how insane that sounds. I know it was wrong, but the fear was so deep, so constant. She looked at me with naked anguish. Every time I diminished you, every time I told you that women should support instead of lead, every time I praised David's mediocrity over your excellence, I was fighting against the voice in my head that said I didn't deserve my place in this family, that I was a fraud who'd stolen a name that wasn't mine. You made me pay for your insecurity, I said, for decades. I know. Tears streamed down her face. I destroyed you to save myself from my own terror. I wounded my daughter because I was too broken to heal myself. And I've lived with that knowledge every day since you left. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother not as the cruel authority figure who'd crushed me, but as a wounded woman who'd been so damaged by her own trauma that she'd inflicted it on someone else. It didn't make what she'd done hurt less, but it made her human in a way she'd never been before. I'm so sorry, Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know it's inadequate. I know it doesn't change anything, but I'm so sorry for what I did to you. I let the silence hold for a moment. Then I spoke, my voice calm but firm. I forgive you for being broken by your own pain. I understand that you were wounded, that you acted out of fear and trauma. I forgive you for that. Hope flickered in her eyes. But I can't have you in my life, I continued. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It means I'm releasing us both from this cycle. I'm choosing to stop carrying your damage forward. The hope died. She looked at me with fresh tears. You'll be financially secure through your shares in the company, I said. I'll ensure you receive fair dividends. I'll never publicly shame you or speak ill of you to others. But there will be no relationship. No phone calls, no dinners, no pretense of mother and daughter. Sarah, please. You wounded me too deeply for too long. You took my childhood, my trust, my sense of belonging. You made me question my worth for 19 years. I've built myself back from that, but I can't rebuild myself while keeping you in my life. The risk is too great. Catherine was crying openly now, her perfect composure completely shattered. The forgiveness I'm offering you is for my freedom, not your comfort, I said gently but firmly. I'm letting go of the anger and the need for you to finally see what you did. I'm releasing myself from the hope that you'll ever truly understand the damage you caused. I'm forgiving you so I can move forward without carrying your burden anymore. What if I change? She asked desperately. What if I get help, see a therapist, do the work? That would be good for you, I said. You should do that for yourself, but it won't change my decision. Some damages can be explained but never repaired. What you did to me falls into that category. I stood signaling the conversation was ending. I wish you well, Mom. I genuinely hope you find peace with your past and healing for your pain, but you'll have to find it without me. Catherine stood shakily, looking lost and broken. At the door, she turned back one last time. For what it's worth, she said, her voice thick with tears. Your grandfather was right about you. You showed uncommon wisdom and strength of character then, and you've proven it 1,000 times over since. I was wrong about everything, and he was right. She left, and I closed the door behind her. I stood alone in my office for a long time, feeling the weight of decades finally lifting from my shoulders. The confrontation I'd been avoiding, the relationship I'd been unable to fully process it, was done. I'd said what needed to be said. I'd forgiven without absolving. I'd released myself from the cycle of pain without pretending it hadn't happened. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly free from my mother. But while I'd closed the door with my mother, another door, one I'd thought was sealed forever, began to open. 2 weeks after my conversation with Catherine, my father called. "Sarah," he said, his voice uncertain. "I was wondering if you might have time for coffee. No agenda, no requests. I'd just like to talk with you if you're willing." I almost said no. After the emotional weight of confronting my mother, I wasn't sure I had the energy for another difficult conversation. But something in his voice, a humility I'd never heard before, made me hesitate. "All right," I said. "Saturday morning, the cafe on Newbury Street." He arrived 10 minutes early. I watched him through the window, sitting alone at a corner table, fidgeting with a napkin. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, his hair completely gray now, his face lined with stress. But there was something different in his bearing, less of the rigid authority I remembered, more openness. I sat down across from him. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I know you didn't have to." "What did you want to talk about?" He took a breath. "I've been seeing a therapist 3 times a week for the past 4 months, and I've joined a men's group that focuses on examining masculinity, weakness, patterns of harm we've perpetuated." I waited. "In therapy, I've had to confront a lot of things I spent decades avoiding. The ways I failed you, the ways I failed David, the ways I failed myself by never becoming the man I should have been." His hands were shaking slightly. "I was a coward, Sarah. I chose the path of least resistance every single time, and you paid the price." "You told me this before," I said. "When you showed up drunk at my house." "I know, but I was drunk then. Desperate. This is different. I'm sober now, and I've done months of hard work to understand not just what I did wrong, but why I did it. And I wanted you to know that I see it clearly now, all of it, without any of the denial I used to hide behind." He pulled out a small notebook worn at the edges. "My therapist had me make a list. Every time I chose Catherine's comfort over your well-being. Every time I stayed silent when I should have protected you. Every instance I can remember where I failed as your father." He opened the notebook. Page after page filled with his precise handwriting. Dates, situations, failures. "I counted 73 major instances," he said quietly. 73 times I knew what was happening was wrong and said nothing, did nothing. That doesn't count the daily dismissals, the casual cruelties I witnessed and allowed." I stared at the notebook, feeling something twist in my chest. "I'm not showing you this to make you feel sorry for me," he continued. "I'm showing you because I need you to know I'm not hiding anymore. I see what I did, I own it, and I'm working every day to become someone different." "Why now?" I asked. "Why after all these years are you suddenly doing this work?" "Because I almost lost the chance entirely." His voice cracked. "When the scandal broke, when everything collapsed, I had a moment of clarity. I looked at my life, my sham of a marriage, my estranged daughter, my son, who I'd failed so completely, he nearly went to prison, and I realized I'd wasted 67 years being a coward." He closed the notebook. "I separated from Catherine 3 months ago. I'm living in a small apartment in Cambridge. I resigned from every board position I still held. I'm rebuilding my identity from scratch, and it's the hardest thing I've ever done." "You separated from Mom." "I had to. I can't heal while staying in a relationship built on dysfunction and avoidance. Catherine needs to do her own work, and I need to do mine. We can't do it together." Over the next hour, he told me about his therapy sessions, about confronting his own father's emotional abuse, the ways he'd internalized messages about strength, meaning silence, and authority, meaning control. About recognizing that choosing Catherine's comfort over my well-being wasn't just weakness, It was a pattern he'd learned from watching his own father sacrifice everyone else's needs to avoid confrontation. He wasn't making excuses. He was explaining the pathology without using it to absolve himself of responsibility. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said as we stood to leave. "I don't even know if I deserve the chance to rebuild any kind of relationship with you. But I'm doing this work regardless because it's who I need to be, whether you're in my life or not." That last part mattered more than anything else he'd said. He wasn't doing this to earn my forgiveness. He was doing it because he'd finally decided to become a better person. I agreed to have coffee again the following month. Over the next 6 months, we met regularly. Always in public, always casual, always with the understanding that he had no right to anything beyond what I chose to give. The change in him became increasingly evident. He'd lost weight, started exercising, dressed more simply. But the biggest transformation was internal. The rigid authoritarianism had been replaced by something softer, more uncertain, more genuinely humble. He asked about my work with real interest, not the performative kind where someone is waiting for their turn to talk. He listened when I explained challenges I was facing with Hartwell Enterprises, and he only offered observations when I explicitly asked for them. "I don't trust my own judgment anymore," he admitted during one conversation. "I made so many bad decisions for so many years. I have to rebuild my ability to think clearly about things." When I shared small vulnerabilities, admitting I was lonely sometimes, or that managing the company was more stressful than I let on, he didn't try to fix anything. He just listened, nodded, sometimes said, "That sounds really hard." It wasn't the father-daughter relationship I'd needed as a child. That was gone, irretrievable. But it was becoming something else. Two adults who shared history and damage, both trying to become better than they'd been. I saw him attend one of David's addiction recovery meetings as a supportive presence. I learned he'd started volunteering at a youth mentoring program working with boys from troubled homes. He was trying in small ways to repair damage in the world, even if he couldn't repair what he'd done to me. 8 months after our first coffee, I attended a business conference where I was giving a keynote on corporate transformation and ethical leadership. I didn't tell my father about it. We'd developed a pattern of keeping our meetings separate from my professional life. But he was there in the audience. I saw him in the back row as I walked onto the stage. He'd come on his own, somehow learned about my speaking engagement, and showed up without telling me. I gave my talk discussing how real change requires confronting uncomfortable truths, how organizations can't heal without acknowledging past failures, how leadership means choosing the difficult right over the easy wrong. When I finished, the audience applauded. I scanned the room and found my father standing, his face wet with tears, clapping harder than anyone else. Afterward, he waited until the crowd had mostly dispersed before approaching me. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. It was the first time he'd ever said those words to me. Not "that's good" or "nice job," but genuine, unqualified pride. The words landed somewhere deep and wounded inside me, a place that had been waiting for 38 years to hear them, and something began to heal. I felt tears prick my eyes. "Thank you." "You've become remarkable," he continued. "Not despite what happened to you, but through the strength you developed surviving it. I wish I could take credit for any of it, but I can't. This is all you, and I'm honored to know you." We stood in that conference center hallway, father and daughter, separated by decades of pain, but connected by fragile threads of honesty and hope. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. The word felt too simple for what was happening between us. It was more like recognition, seeing each other clearly for the first time without the distortions of anger or guilt or desperate need. We went to dinner that night, and for the first time I felt like I was sitting across from a real person, rather than the ghost of the father I'd needed and never had. But healing myself required more than fixing broken family bonds. It meant ensuring no one else would suffer what I had. The idea came to me one night alone in my brownstone, reading emails from women who'd somehow found my contact information after the business press coverage. They wrote about their own families, their own rejections. Daughters told they weren't smart enough, weren't valuable enough, weren't worth investing in. Women in their 50s and 60s who'd spent decades believing they were failures because their families had told them so. Each email felt like reading my own story through someone else's lens. I'd built 2 successful companies, reclaimed my family's business, rebuilt relationships where possible, and set boundaries where necessary. I'd proven everything I'd set out to prove, but these women were still out there, still trapped in the same cycle I'd escaped. That's when I knew what I had to do. I called a meeting with my financial advisors and attorneys. I want to establish a foundation, I told them. The Hartwell Women's Initiative. Purpose: supporting women who've been denied opportunities by their own families. Over the next 3 months, we built the structure. The foundation would provide financial support for education, business startups, and career transitions. But more importantly, it would offer mentorship, professional networking, and psychological support for women trying to rebuild after family betrayal. I committed $2 million annually from my personal wealth. I recruited successful women from my network to serve as mentors, CEOs, entrepreneurs, professionals who'd overcome obstacles to build meaningful careers. I hired a small staff led by a woman who'd escaped an abusive family situation and built a career in nonprofit management. The application process was simple. Tell us your story. Tell us what you need. Tell us what you want to build. The first year, we received over 300 applications. Reading them broke my heart repeatedly. A 48-year-old woman whose parents had refused to let her attend college, forcing her into an early marriage instead. She'd divorced at 45 and was trying to get a degree while working 2 jobs. She'd been told by her family that it was too late for her, that she should accept her limitations. A 32-year-old who'd been promised her grandmother's inheritance to start a business only to have her brother steal it with their parents' blessing. She'd given up on her dream because she couldn't afford the startup costs. A 61-year-old who'd spent 40 years in her family's business doing the actual strategic work while her brothers took credit. When she finally demanded recognition, they forced her out without severance or acknowledgement. She was trying to start a consulting practice but had no confidence after decades of being told she wasn't capable. Story after story after story. Invisible daughters. Forgotten sisters. Women whose families had systematically crushed their potential because it threatened someone else's comfort or ego. We selected 47 recipients that first year. I insisted on meeting each one personally. The orientation session was held in a hotel conference room in downtown Boston. 47 women ranging in age from 19 to 68 gathered nervously. Most had never met anyone else with similar experiences. They'd spent years thinking they were alone in their family dysfunction. I stood in front of them and told my story. Not the sanitized version I'd given to business press. The real version. Growing up invisible. Being told I wasn't important to the company's future. Having my inheritance manipulated. Leaving with $200. Working 3 jobs while eating ramen. Building Vance Tech from nothing. The Christmas dinner confrontation. Everything. I'm telling you this not because I want sympathy, I said, but because I want you to know that what happened to you wasn't your fault. Your family's inability to see your worth says everything about them and nothing about you. Several women were crying. One older woman in the back raised her hand. How did you stop believing them? She asked, her voice shaking. How did you stop thinking you were actually worthless like they said? I didn't, I admitted. Not for years. Even after I'd built a successful company, part of me still heard my father's voice saying I'd never amount to anything. But eventually I realized something: I could keep trying to prove them wrong, or I could start building for myself instead of against them. Another woman asked, "Did you ever stop being angry?" Yes and no. The hot anger, the burning rage that drove me for years that eventually faded. But I'm still angry about injustice, about systems that crush people for being different or threatening. I just channel it differently now, into building things that matter, into helping people like you. We spent 3 hours together that day. The women shared their stories with each other, forming connections that would become deep friendships. I watched them realize they weren't damaged or defective. They were survivors of a specific kind of family abuse that society rarely acknowledges. The Foundation's impact went far beyond the financial support we provided. We created a network, monthly meetings, online forums, mentorship pairings. Women who'd spent decades feeling alone suddenly had a community of people who understood viscerally what they'd been through. Maria, the 48-year-old, denied college, completed her degree in 2 years while receiving a modest monthly stipend from us. She graduated summa cum laude and got accepted to graduate school. When she walked across that stage, 7 other Foundation recipients were in the audience cheering for her. Jessica, who'd had her inheritance stolen, used our business startup grant to launch a financial literacy consulting practice. Within 18 months, she was profitable and employing 2 people. She came back to speak at our second-year orientation, telling new recipients, "Your family said you weren't capable. They were wrong. You're here because you're capable of remarkable things." Patricia, the 61-year-old, forced out of her family business, built a consulting practice that within a year had more clients than she could handle. She told me, "I spent 40 years believing I was only valuable as support for my brothers. Now I know I was always the strategic mind they were taking credit for." Watching these women reclaim their potential gave me a sense of purpose beyond anything I'd experienced in business. This was the legacy my grandfather would have wanted, not just the Hartwell family name, but a Hartwell legacy that actually helped people. The Foundation received media attention. Business publications wanted to cover it. Women's magazines requested interviews. For the first time, I agreed to share my story publicly. I sat for an interview with a journalist from a major women's magazine, and I told her everything. The full story, nothing sanitized. "Why are you willing to go public now?" she asked. "Because I want other women to know that family dysfunction isn't their fault. I want daughters who are being dismissed and limited to understand they're not crazy for feeling hurt. I want women in their 50s and 60s who've spent decades believing their family's assessment of their worth to know it's never too late to reclaim yourself." The article ran with the headline, "The Daughter They Threw Away: How One Woman Transformed Family Betrayal into a Legacy of Empowerment." The response was overwhelming. Thousands of women reached out sharing their own stories. Women in their 20s who'd been told to give up career ambitions for more appropriate paths. Women in their 40s who'd been passed over for family business leadership in favor of less competent brothers. Women in their 60s who'd been written out of wills because they'd dared to have opinions or ambitions. The invisible daughters, the disappointing ones, the ones who'd been told they were selfish for wanting anything beyond what their families prescribed. I received letters that said things like, "I thought I was the only one. I've been carrying shame for 30 years thinking there was something wrong with me. Your story gave me permission to stop trying to earn their approval." I started doing speaking engagements, specifically focused on family dysfunction and recovery. Not corporate events about business strategy, but talks for women's groups, recovery organizations, therapy, conferences. My message was consistent. Escaping toxic family dynamics isn't selfish, it's survival. Success built on your own terms is more valuable than acceptance on someone else's. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not something you owe your abusers. You can honor your own healing without requiring your family to change. The Foundation grew. By the 3rd year, we were supporting over 150 women annually. We'd helped 63 women complete degrees, launched 42 businesses, and facilitated career transitions for over 100 women who'd been trapped in situations where their families controlled their professional opportunities. But more than the numbers, I treasured the transformations. Watching women who'd arrived at orientation sessions hunched and uncertain stand tall at our annual gatherings, confident and thriving. Seeing them form friendships, support networks, professional partnerships. Hearing them tell their own stories without shame. One evening at an annual Foundation gala, a woman in her late 50s approached me. I recognized her from our second cohort. She'd been denied educational opportunities by her parents and had finally completed her MBA at 54. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Not just for the financial support, though that changed my life, but for helping me understand that I wasn't broken, that my family's treatment of me was about their dysfunction, not my worth." She paused, her eyes bright. "I have a daughter. She's 15. And because of what I learned through this foundation, I'm raising her completely differently than I was raised. I'm telling her she's brilliant and capable and that the world is hers to claim. Your pain saved not just me, but the next generation. My daughter will never doubt her worth the way I did." Standing there, hearing that, I realized I'd created something that would outlive me, something that would ripple forward through generations. Women raising daughters who believed in themselves. Daughters becoming women who wouldn't accept being diminished. This was the legacy that mattered. Not the business success, not the reclaimed company, not even the personal vindication. This transformation of pain into power of isolation, into community of shame, into strength. But there was still one truth I hadn't learned, one my grandfather had protected until I was ready to understand it. Creating something meaningful from pain had opened something inside me. I hadn't expected the possibility of building a life beyond revenge and achievement. The shift started small in ways I almost didn't notice. I'd met James Chen during the Hale investigation. He was a federal prosecutor in the Financial Crimes Division, one of the people who'd worked on building the case against Hale. He was 42 with an easy smile that contrasted with the intensity he brought to his work. Brilliant, ethical, and completely unimpressed by wealth or status. We'd had coffee a few times during the investigation to discuss legal strategy. Then, after Hale's indictment, James had asked if I'd like to have dinner sometime. Not to discuss the case, just dinner. I'd almost said no. My track record with relationships was abysmal. I'd never let anyone close enough to actually see me. But something made me say yes. That first dinner stretched into 4 hours of conversation about everything except work. He told me about growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Queens, being the first in his family to attend college, choosing prosecution over corporate law despite the pay difference, because he wanted to do something that mattered. When he asked about my background, I gave him the abbreviated version I usually offered estranged from family, built my career from scratch. He didn't push for more. He just said, "That must have been hard," and moved on to asking what I did for fun. I realized I didn't have a good answer to that question. Over the following months, our relationship developed slowly. James never pushed for more than I could give. When I was guarded, he was patient. When I tested him with difficult truths about my past, he listened without judgment or unsolicited advice. 6 months into dating, I told him the full story. Everything. The childhood dismissals, the stolen inheritance, the years of struggle, the confrontation with my family, all of it. He listened for 2 hours, his hand holding mine across the table, and when I finished, he didn't offer pity or try to fix anything. "Thank you for trusting me with that," he said simply. "I can't imagine how hard that was to survive, let alone to share." That night I realized I'd stopped waiting for him to reveal a hidden agenda. I'd stopped analyzing every gesture for signs of manipulation or control. I was learning to trust again, and it felt terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. But James wasn't the only change in my life. I started taking painting classes on Wednesday evenings at a community studio. I had no particular talent for it, but I loved the meditative quality of mixing colors and putting brush to canvas. For 3 hours each week, I could stop being CEO Hartwell and just be Sarah trying to capture the way light fell across a still life. I traveled to places I'd always wanted to see but never prioritized a week in Tuscany, a long weekend in Iceland. Not business trips with packed schedules, but actual vacations where I wandered museums and cafes without checking my phone every 5 minutes. I built genuine friendships with people who knew me as Sarah, not as the founder of Vance Tech, or the woman who'd exposed a money laundering scheme. Rebecca, a painter from my Wednesday class who worked as a librarian and had never heard of Hartwell Enterprises. Miguel James's college roommate who taught high school history and told terrible dad jokes. And I adopted a dog. Luna was a 3-year-old shepherd mix I found at a rescue shelter. She'd been abandoned, then returned twice by families who said she was too anxious and had trust issues. When I met her, she cowered in the back of her kennel, watching me with wary eyes. The parallel wasn't lost on me. I took her home, and we navigated trust together. She learned that I would feed her consistently, that I wouldn't hurt her, that this home was permanent. I learned that healing doesn't follow a linear path. Some days she was confident and playful, other days she startled at sudden movements. We were both works in progress. The hypervigilance that had protected me for 2 decades began to ease. I started sleeping through the night without waking at 3 a.m., mentally reviewing everything that could go wrong. I laughed more easily. I occasionally went entire days without thinking about my family's betrayal. I was learning what it meant to simply exist rather than constantly prove. Perhaps most surprisingly, I found myself building an unexpected relationship with David. He'd been sober for 8 months now, attending meetings regularly, and working as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm completely unconnected to our family. He'd asked me not to use my influence to help him get the position he wanted to earn it on his own merit. He called me one evening, his voice uncertain. "I know we're not exactly close, but I could use some advice. Not about the job, about how you survived those first years when you had nothing, when every day felt like you were drowning." I invited him to dinner at my house. We sat in my kitchen, Luna asleep at our feet, and I told him the truth about those brutal early years, the fear, the exhaustion, the constant battle with self-doubt. "The thing no one tells you," I said, "is that building from nothing is incredibly lonely. Everyone around you has safety nets you don't have. They have families to fall back on, trust funds for emergencies, connections that open doors. You have yourself, and that's it." "How did you keep going?" he asked. "Stubbornness mostly, and anger for a long time. But eventually I realized I was building something real, not just a career, but an identity that was actually mine. That's what kept me going." Our relationship would never be what it might have been if our parents had raised us differently. Too much damage, too many years of being pitted against each other. But it was becoming something honest. He called every few weeks sometimes to ask advice, sometimes just to talk. He told me about his meetings, about the work he was doing to understand his addiction, about making amends to people he'd hurt. "I apologized to Jennifer Morrison last week," he said during one call. "The woman you promoted to director. I took credit for her analysis work for 3 years. She deserved to hear that I knew what I'd done and that it was wrong." "How did she respond?" "She said she appreciated it, but that your promotion and salary correction meant more than my apology ever could." She was right. I realized I'd let go of most of my anger toward him. David had been a victim too, just in a different way. Our parents had given him everything except the tools to actually succeed, then blamed him when he failed. He was finally doing the work to become someone real, instead of someone performed. One Saturday afternoon in early spring, James and I were walking Luna through the common when my phone rang. "Governor Vance." "Sarah." His voice was warm but serious. "Do you have time to come by my office this week? There's something I need to give you, something your grandfather entrusted to me 24 years ago." My heart began to pound. "The letter." "Yes. Your father told me about your conversation with Catherine, about everything that's happened since. I think you're ready now to know everything." I looked at James, at Luna trotting happily beside us, at the spring sun breaking through clouds. I'd built a life. A real one. I'd created a legacy that mattered. I'd learned to trust and be vulnerable and find joy in simple things. And then Governor Vance called with words that would complete the circle. "It's time you knew everything." I arrived at Governor Vance's private office on a Tuesday morning. He'd moved out of the official governor's residence 2 years earlier, after choosing not to run for re-election, returning to private legal practice and consulting. His office was in a brownstone near Beacon Hill, quiet and filled with books. He greeted me at the door, and I saw something in his expression I'd never quite seen before, a mixture of solemnity and relief, as if he'd been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was finally able to set it down. "Come in," he said gently. I've been waiting for this day." He led me to his private study where a small wooden box sat on his desk. It was simple dark walnut with brass hinges that had aged to a soft patina. No lock, just a clasp. "Your grandfather gave this to me 2 weeks before he died," Vance said. "He made me promise 2 things: that I would find you if your family failed you, and that I would give you this only when you were strong enough to understand it. Not when you were broken and desperate, but when you were whole." My hands trembled as I reached for the box. "He knew," Vance continued quietly. "He knew what his son was, what Catherine's wounds would drive her to do. He couldn't prevent it. He tried with the will with his recommendations, but he knew that ultimately you would have to walk your own path. This was his way of ensuring you'd know you never walked it alone." I opened the box. Inside were photographs. First me as a child with my grandfather. One of us in his study, me perhaps 7 years old, pointing at something in a book while he smiled down at me. Another of us in the garden, both laughing at some shared joke. A third of my 8th grade science fair project, him standing beside my display with unmistakable pride. I'd never seen these photos. My parents must have had copies, but they'd never shown me. Beneath the photographs was a copy of his will, the original, with handwritten notes in the margins. Notes about his reasoning, his hopes, his fears. And beneath that, a sealed envelope with my name written in his distinctive hand. My fingers shook as I opened it. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, but his handwriting was as clear as if he'd written it yesterday. "My dearest Sarah," it began. I had to stop, take a breath. Vance quietly placed a glass of water beside me and stepped back, giving me space. I continued reading. "If you are reading this, it means my fears have come true. It means my son and his wife failed to see what I always saw in you: brilliance, courage, and a heart too good for the world they wanted to shape you for. I have known Robert all his life, and I love him as a father must. But I also know his weaknesses. He bends to strong personalities. He chooses comfort over courage. He will fail you not out of malice, but out of the cowardice that has defined too much of his life. I know Catherine's story, though she does not know I know it all. I know about the nightmares she had for years after her parents died. I know about the therapist she saw as a teenager who told me she struggled with feeling she belonged anywhere. I gave her a home and a name because I loved her, but I could never fully heal the wound of her loss. And I fear that wound will make her hurt you. I have watched you since you were small, my brilliant girl. You asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. You challenged unfairness even when it cost you. You cried when you saw injustice and tried to fix it with the tools available to a child. You were never going to be their version of a perfect daughter. You were going to be something far greater. My vision blurred. I wiped my eyes and kept reading. I am leaving you the majority of my estate because you have the wisdom and character to use it well. But I know Catherine may find ways to manipulate this. I know the trust structure might be abused. I have done what I can legally to protect you, and I have asked my dearest friend Samuel to watch over you. But I cannot prevent all the pain that might come. If you are reading this, you have survived whatever they put you through. I am so sorry I could not prevent it, but I also believe you needed to build your own strength without my protection. The money in my will was never the real inheritance. It was a safety net I hoped you'd never need but wanted to provide. The real inheritance is the mind you were born with, sharp, curious, relentlessly logical. It is the heart that refuses to become cruel despite pain, that stays soft even when the world demands hardness. It is the unbreakable knowledge that you were deeply, completely loved by someone who saw exactly who you were and believed in who you would become. Build your empire, my brilliant girl. Not to prove them wrong, they are not worthy of that energy. Build it because you can. Build it because the world needs what you have to offer. Build it because creating something meaningful from nothing is the truest expression of human strength. And when you do, when you stand at the top of what you have built with your own hands and your own mind, remember this: the Hartwell name is just a name. Your worth is your own. It always has been. You were enough when you were 7 years old reading above your grade level. You were enough when you were 13 and they dismissed your achievements. You will be enough whatever age you are when you read this, whether you have built an empire or are still struggling to survive. I wish I could have stayed to see what you will become, but I know with certainty that transcends death that you will be extraordinary. All my love across whatever distance separates us now, your grandfather William. I read it 3 times. The first time through tears that made the words swim, the second time slowly absorbing every sentence, the third time out loud hearing his voice in the words, as if he were speaking directly to me across 24 years. When I finally looked up, Vance had tears on his face too. He knew, I whispered. He knew everything that would happen. He knew the people involved, Vance corrected gently. He couldn't know the specifics. But he understood his son's weakness and Catherine's wounds well enough to predict the shape of what might come. And he loved you enough to build protections that would last beyond his lifetime. You, I said, looking at him. You were the protection. I was honored to be, Vance said. Watching you build yourself from nothing, seeing you become exactly who he believed you would be, it has been the privilege of my life. I only wish he could have seen it. I looked down at the letter again, at the photographs, at the evidence of a love so deep it had reached across death itself to protect me. And I finally understood. I hadn't survived despite being alone. I'd survived because I never truly was. My grandfather's love had protected me across 2 decades and beyond death itself. Through Vance's guidance at exactly the right moment. Through the trust fund that, even depleted, gave me the seed capital to start Vance Tech. Through the knowledge finally revealed that someone had seen my worth when everyone else was blind to it. That was the real inheritance. Not money, not the family business I'd reclaimed, not even the foundation I'd built or the lives I'd helped transform. The real inheritance was knowing I had always been enough exactly as I was. The real victory wasn't revenge or success or proving anyone wrong. It was this standing in Vance's office at 38 years old, holding a letter from someone who'd loved me unconditionally, and finally believing what he'd always known. I was extraordinary not because of what I'd built or overcome, but because of who I'd always been. And I had never for a single moment of my life been alone. Sarah's story didn't end with revenge. It ended with something far more powerful, understanding that her worth had never depended on her family's recognition. She learned that forgiveness isn't about absolving those who hurt you, it's about freeing yourself from their grip. That true inheritance isn't money or status, but the unshakable knowledge that you were loved and seen by someone who mattered. And most importantly, that you can transform the deepest pain into a legacy that lifts others. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or questioned your worth because of how others treated you, I want you to know you are enough exactly as you are. Please subscribe to this channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you experienced family dynamics like Sarah's? How did you find your strength? Your story matters, and this community is here to listen. Hit that subscribe button and let's continue this conversation together.